A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My name is Jim Suzy. I'm the director of the New Jersey chapter of the Council for Social Justice, which is a program of ICNA, and I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar on Islam's position on gender identity this afternoon. This webinar is presented by the Islamic Learning Foundation, or ILF, which is a project of ICNA. We have three speakers this afternoon who are going to address various aspects of gender identity from an Islamic perspective. Each speaker will address us for about 30 minutes, after which time we will take questions from the audience for that speaker. If we have time at the end, we will take questions addressed to the panel as a whole. If you have a question, please post it to the comments section for this webinar. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Imam Asif Hirani. His segment is titled Youth Challenges. Imam Hirani has a master's in Islamic studies from Karachi University and obtained his PhD from Al Madina International University in Tafsir and Ulum ul Quran. Please welcome Imam Asif Hirani.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Brother Suzy. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa ala amma ba'd. So first of all, it's a great honor to do a program for ILF and ICNA. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give barakah in this project and in this program and in the time of the speakers and organizers, including the other respected speakers, Dr. Suzy and Sheikh Kaiser Aslam. So I just want to give you a disclaimer that I actually taught a class on this for 16 hours. 16 hours. So it's very difficult to just summarize the entire topic in 35 minutes. I'll try my best, inshallah, but because I'm going first, alhamdulillah, so whatever aspect is remaining, especially focusing on youth, I would request Dr. Suzy and Sheikh Kaiser to focus on that. I know you have your own focus, but if you can just compensate my deficiency, inshallah ta'ala. I just want to discuss perhaps three things, inshallah. But before we can start, let's focus on this topic of gender identity and entire topic of sexuality from the youth perspective. Right now, subhanAllah, if you see our situation in America right now, especially in this month, where people are taking so much pride in disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will going to see that the entire Western civilization for the last few decades, you will see some strange things. You will see some weird things. You will see people are swinging from one pendulum to other. I'll give you one example. Back in the days, almost 100 years ago, in America, in the United States of America, women did not have a right to vote. We were concerned for women not getting enough rights. Just few decades ago, even we were concerned for women not getting enough rights. Now, 100 years later, we don't even know what is a woman. Such a swing. We are swinging like pendulum from not allowing women to even vote, and now redefining even the basic definitions of gender. It tells us that we are swinging like pendulum from one extreme to the other, and it makes sense because a society who have removed divine guidance, any guidance coming from God in their social life, in their collective life, in their communal life, you would expect them to swing like pendulum, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن لَمْ يَجْعَلِ اللَّهُ لَهُ نُورًا فَمَا لَهُ مِن نُورٍ. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala won't grant you divine light, then there is no light for you. Then you will be lost in darkness, going from one extremes to the other extremes. From the extremes of masculinity to the waves and storms of feminism, now to the red pill movement, from the gender fluidity to the gender wars, we are swinging like pendulum, responding to one extreme from the other extreme. And this is the reason why it's happening to us, is because there is nothing which can tie us together, and that can only happen when we go back to divine guidance. Subhanallah, I was just talking to some of the youth yesterday. I'm in Houston right now. I was talking to YM Houston yesterday, last night, and I was talking to them that, subhanallah, a few decades ago, in America, a few decades ago, homosexuality carried a social stigma. Now, it is not only considered as a legitimate act, but it is actually part of my identity. And I will give a moral justification if you will going to say that homosexuality is a sin. Just a simple fact, homosexuality is haram or a sin in Islam, will be considered as a hate speech or a bigot or a lunatic fringe argument, because a sudden shift came in the community and in this society, in this Western civilization, few decades ago. This was considered as a bad thing. It carried a social stigma. What happened? What went wrong with this entire Western civilization, that we are not able to even identify forget about the rights of men and women, just a basic definition of what is a woman. Forget about the rights of human rights. What is human? And this is basically a confusion which all of us are struggling with. Our morality, our basic definitions are melting like plastic today. If what I would consider as a parent-child loving conversation with my child, if I have to say to my kids that marriage is a sacred bond between a man and a woman, it will be considered by certain segments of our community in the West as a hate speech now. That how can you say this, that marriage is between a man and a woman? So we are living in a very strange world, a very weird world covered with the godless society. So we need to go back to divine guidance to find the proper solution, because that's the only solution we have as a Muslim, by using our reason and going back to divine guidance. Because once divine guidance is removed, as it is removed from the Western civilization, you will see the social sciences and these philosophies will come, and they will going to swing from one pendulum to other, responding from one extreme and one jahiliyyah to the other jahiliyyah. Okay, now let's start those three things which I just said. Brother Sue, just remind me when my time is done, subhanallah, because I just don't want to take more time. I have other commitments, and I want to get benefit from Dr. Suzy and Sheikh Kaiser, inshallah, as well. So first, let's understand that we are living in the time which social scientists or our philosophers will going to explain this from the perspective of philosophy, at a postmodern time. And I have to explain that in an easy language. So in Islam, we say we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We live our life like Allah-centric, God-centric life. Everything we do in our life should be, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be center of attention, center of our universe. From etiquettes of using restroom to the etiquettes of running society, from marriage to the job, everything we have to be dependent on the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is Allah-centric, God-centric life, the concept of ibadah in Islam. And we also believe that we do not have absolute freedom, rather we have limited freedom under the guidelines of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't go beyond that. Our choices, our freedom, our feelings don't go beyond that, whatever is permissible circle given by divine guidance. And we submit our feelings, our freedom to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of love, not as with an adversary lens. This is extremely important. Ghayatul hubb. One of the concepts of ibadah, the Qayyim says, is extreme amount of love should be there when you are doing this. And we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have given us enough guidance that whether I am in the masjid or outside of the masjid, to guide me to live a better life in all the aspects of life, not only in the masjid. So this is basically the concept of ibadah in Islam. Now, when you comes to the postmodern concept of ibadah, postmodern concept of gender identity, this is extremely important point now. In postmodernism, by the way, postmodernism, I have to teach you from the philosophy perspective a little bit. What is postmodernity? Postmodernity, as the name suggests, something comes after modernity. So now what is modernity? Just quickly, modernity came as a philosophy, not as a technology. So as a philosophy, modernity as a post-enlightenment phenomena is explaining you few centuries ago in Western Europe, they witness the bloodbath between different denominations of Christianity. They practice Christianity. And Catholics, Orthodox, Protestant, they were killing each other using the same biblical verses for justifying their violence. And on top of that, the post-enlightenment and modernity movement even witnessed the worst theocracy from churches, abuse, whether it's financial or sexual abuse. Just combining all these factors and connect the dots, they eventually came with the conclusion, with multiple other factors. They came that it is not possible or feasible or plausible to allow Christianity or Jesus or biblical God to come out in the social sciences, because the moment they will come out of the churches, we will going to have the same nightmares. So reduce the church, reduce the Jesus, reduce the biblical God, reduce the biblical morality to the church, so that once they are coming out, they cannot quote Bible, they cannot use Jesus references, because everyone is using this and they are basically creating chaos in the society by the bloodbath and their own interpretation. So now the question comes, this is a modernity. Now the modernity says we won't give any regard to revelation in our social sciences, in our economics, in politics, and now obviously in sexuality. Now the question comes, how will we define what is good and what is bad? Because now Jesus is only relevant in the churches. They said, and by the way, this phenomenon is called the secularization. Then they said, well, we won't give any regard to revelation. The way we will find out what is good and what is bad, what is truth and what is falsehood in collective life, in social life, in economics, in politics, and now even in sexuality, is through reason. Is through reason. Is through rational. Is through aql. Is through intellect. Because we cannot give regard to revelation, because revelation gives us nightmares, because we had a worse experience from Christianity. Until 1950s, 60s, modernity lasted, but then their civilization came from the womb of modernity as a reaction of modernity called postmodernity. And they asked modernity that you are saying everything we can figure out with reason, with no regard to revelation, but whose reason we are talking about? People have different reason. They might say, oh, actually, we will figure out everything with the truth, with the capital T. Postmodernists will say, whose truth we are talking about? Everyone have their different understanding of the truth. So postmodernists said that even modernity have problem. So postmodernists said that we would neither give regard to revelation, because they borrowed that from modernity, and we won't give regard to reason or rational. Now the question to the postmodernists, that then how you will going to define what is good and what is bad? How you're going to define what is truth and what is falsehood? Then the postmodernists said that because neither we are giving regard to revelation nor to reason, we will going to identify with our feelings, everything with our feelings. I will going to do how I feel. And that's why in our times, the entire centrality, because we are in a postmodern world right now, unfortunately, we are Muslims, you don't even recognize this, entire centrality, entire authority, entire focus is being given to the feelings, not to the revelation, not to the reason. And people have an adversarial lens when they will going to use revelation. Whenever you use God, hadith, religion, people usually have an adversarial lens to it, because they have a history from the theocracy of Christianity. And entire centrality is given to feelings. And if religion is not confirming or affirming my feelings, or any outside morality is not confirming my feelings, then it will be a threat to my feeling. It will be a threat to myself. This is the entire concept of postmodern sexuality. For more details, you can read my book. I recently wrote a book on this, Islamic versus Postmodern Paradigm of Sexuality. It's available on Amazon. Anyway, now it's extremely important to understand this before we can see these 2-3 different diagrams. I will just give you one example to make this point more clear. What does I mean when I said in the postmodern world, the entire focus is shifted from reason and revelation to feelings. Let's say 5-6 decades ago, and by the way, not only myself, but even some of the other faith-based scholars, biblical scholars, wrote about this, especially Carl Trueman from A Strange New World. So let's say 5-6 years ago, I'm giving an example of how this postmodern shift impacted us in mainstream community in America. If 5-6 decades ago, if a biological man goes to therapist and says, I am a woman trapped in the body of men. So I'm biological man, but I'm feeling like a woman. I'm a woman trapped in the body of men. 5-6 decades ago, that doctor or therapist would have said, okay, take these medicine. We will going to make sure your feelings are in line with your body. Your feelings will be changed, but your body cannot be changed. Your biology or gender cannot be changed. It's an undeniable fact. Now flip into 2023. just 5 decades, 4 decades later, if you will ask the same question to a therapist or to a left-leaning doctor or Freudist psychologist, that I am a woman trapped in the body of men, same question, then they will say, okay, let's change your body, whether through gender reassignment surgeries or some other options. Let's change your body to bring in line with your feelings. Now, my question to you is that who is going to decide whether we are going to change the body towards the feelings or feelings towards the body? Who are going to decide whether we will trump the psychology will trump biology, or biology will trump psychology, or body will trump feelings, or feelings will trump body? For us, we are dependent on divine guidance. It's a metaphysical question. If you are an atheist person, then you should depend on philosophy. It's a metaphysical question. But that entire focus on the psychology and then eventually looking down on the biological facts, this shows that we are currently living in a postmodern society where people feelings, they worship their feelings. Allah says this twice in the Quran, in Jasiyah and Al-Furqan, that have you seen a person who worships his hawa, his feelings, his self or herself or her feelings? And hawa can be translated in multiple different ways. So this is what's happening. And subhanAllah, Islam is completely different in terms of its framework. If I have a feeling, I can have that feeling either praiseworthy or blameworthy. If that's praiseworthy, Islam says, then we have to promote that. And it's a blameworthy, I have to work on that to make it subservient to the Quran and Sunnah. I'll give you an example. If I have to pray Salatul Zuhr, it's Zuhr Salah time here in Houston. If I have to pray Salatul Zuhr, can I say, oh, I'm not feeling to pray, so I'm not praying? The answer is no. Even if I'm not feeling, hashtag who cares? I still have to pray. If I'm fasting after Salatul Asr, obviously I will feel hungry. Obviously I will feel thirsty after Salatul Asr. But Allah says not until Maghrib. You cannot eat or drink until Maghrib. Even though I'm feeling thirsty and hungry, but I cannot eat because I cannot act on my feeling. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's instructions are more important than my feeling. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching me. When you come to the postmodern world, where entire centrality is given to your feelings, and you will interpret or reinterpret the outside morality and religion so that it can confirm your feelings, then the arguments like my body, my choice, personal bodily autonomy, this entire individualistic idea, individualization or privatization of the self, then eventually you will going to interpret the outside world or see the outside world as a threat as long as they are not confirming my feelings. So this is a problem with the postmodern world where people are worshiping themselves. Their worldview is not God-centric, Allah-centric. Their worldview is human-centric, or honestly speaking, ego-centric, which circulates around them. You will going to see every institution, and you will going to find out what I'm getting from this institution, whether in the institution of marriage, in the institution of the family, and so on and so forth. You will see what I'm getting from it instead of looking at what is your responsibility, because this is the gift of postmodernism. Very egocentric, very selfish attitude, because the entire focus is on you. Just be yourself. You have heard this so many times. It was an idea of Jacques Rousseau. Just be your authentic self. Well, in Islam, we don't say that you be yourself. In Islam, we say just improve yourself, keep improving yourself under the divine guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, coming back to those two diagrams, which brother Suzy, can we put those diagrams, inshallah ta'ala? Okay, this is first diagram, feeling, action, identity. If you have to ask me as a youth, what's the basic difference in the gender identity, I would say this is a difference. Islamic versus postmodern gender identity, these are the differences. In Islam, we say these three things will be tied, these three things will be separated. These three things cannot be tied together. These three things will be separated. What are those three things? First, our feelings should be separated, then our actions. And then our action and feelings should be separated, then our identity. What I mean, I'll give you an example. So for Islamic paradigm, if I have a feeling to drink or to do zina, should I act on that feeling? No. I should check whether that feeling is halal or haram. If it's halal, I should go for it and act on it. If it's haram, I should not act on it. I should not morally justify just the presence of that feeling that I will act on it because this is my true self. This is Islam. You check whether it's halal, haram, good or bad under the divine guidance. If you act on something, if you do something haram, if you're talking to your friend in college if they are doing zina or they are drinking or drugs or whatever, what will be your advice as a practicing Muslim brother or sister? You will ask them to do tawbah. Their identity is the same identity. They won't be identified by that sin, because the moment you identify with that sin, you will morally justify with that identity. This is a problem with identity paradigm. The moment you will going to identify yourself separately, you will say, we don't care for Sharia, we don't care for halal haram. This is how I was created, so now laws need to change for me. We would say, Habibi, it's just the feeling, even if you acted on it, whether you acted or not, but laws will be same. You have to consider this as shahwat, like we all have shahwat and desires, and you need to give respect. You cannot say, I was born that way, so the laws need to change so that I can act in whatever way I feel. This is a problem. In postmodern paradigm, they would say these three things are connected. If you get a feeling for something, go for it, they will say. Act on it. And if you have a feeling for something or act on it, or without acting, there's the presence of the feeling. They would say, this is who you are. So you are not encountering homosexual act, rather you are gay. The language say you are gay. And this is the problem. We say we don't accept this identity paradigm. What we would say, that you encountered such an act and come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, live a lifestyle which is Sharia compliant, and inshallah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will going to give you reward for being patient. Maybe you will get more reward than any heterosexual person because of your extra layer of patience for the same-sex attraction. So this is extremely, extremely important, that we don't compromise just because of the basis of gender, just because of the basis of identity. And someone might ask, what's the problem, Imam Asif, if someone is identifying themselves with their feelings? Well, there are multiple problems. First problem, that if we will just generally, if we will allow in the entire world, people can identify themselves with their feelings, then people want to kill each other when they are angry. Should we allow this? People want to, as a young person, people want to drive 150 miles per hour. Should police and cops allow them? When cop or police will pull you over and ask you, why were you driving 150 miles per hour? Can you say to that cop, my car, my choice, personal car autonomy, and no, subhanallah, I was driving fast because America was built on freedom. So please, this is my choice. I identified as a fast driver. I had a feeling of driving fast. None of these arguments will work, Habibi. You will get a ticket and a cop will say you that your feeling or your freedom or your choice of driving fast need to be restricted, because you might harm yourself or harm others by driving fast. And this is the exactly same argument we are saying, but we are saying go back to divine guidance to define the boundaries of the harm. That's it. Similarly, if the arguments come, what's the harm in it if two people are doing something in their private room? Well, multiple levels of harm. How do you define harm? Just the physical harm? Don't you see that the nuclear family destroyed the entire social fabric in America? It happened because of the premarital relationship. It happened because sex was disconnected with marriage and reproduction. Now, infidelity is increasing, fatherlessness is increasing. People are 1.9 million, again, 1.9 million kids are fatherless in America at this point, according to last year's statistics. This is because of the absolute freedom without any restriction in terms of sexuality. We need restriction, and everyone have restriction. The modernists argue that, okay, put the restriction of consent and no harm. We would say use divine guidance along with these things so that we can have a better society, a family-oriented paradigm. So this is first paradigm. Brother Suze, it's 2:33. Should I end here or should we discuss another paradigm?
Inshallah, go ahead. Feel free to discuss another paradigm.
Okay. I will going to add one more and then I'll be done, inshallah. Can you put the second slide? Another one. Yes, this one. Jazakumullahu khairan. So this is the second paradigm I want to discuss from Islamic versus postmodern paradigm. This is, I would say, instead of postmodern paradigm, you can say this is a modern paradigm. And even we continue this in postmodernism because this even it stems from reason, and then eventually it became the feeling-based argument. So in Islam, the second paradigm, in Islam, we put these three things together under the divine guidance. In modern postmodern paradigm, we threw divine guidance out of the window, and these three things are separated. They are not together. What are those three things which in Islam we put together? Islam says sex, reproduction, family, or marriage. Sex, reproduction, marriage, or family. They are connected together under divine guidance. Under divine guidance. So if a person wants to have sex, Islam says, okay, have with your spouse after marriage only. Obviously, birth control is permissible if there is need. There's an entire discussion of the discourse of the abortion, which is a little different than Catholicism. But by default, the intention should be to have reproduction. Yes, initially for general extreme necessity and needs, it is permissible to use birth control according to some scholars. But it is not by default. By default is that you should look for the reproduction, because society will become dysfunctional. So reproduction, family, marriage is connected with sex in Islamic paradigm, and they are actually locked under divine guidance. Now, when you throw divine guidance out of the window, you basically open the knot. And now these three things, now sex is disconnected with reproduction, and now sex is disconnected with marriage. How sex was disconnected with reproduction, it's a long story. I discuss this in my book, and Islamic versus postmodern paradigm of sexuality. You can read for more information. Basically, the birth control pill came in 1960s. The entire sexual revolution came. Now, previously, sex was a responsibility. Now, sex, instead of reproduction, became a recreation. Now, sex is becoming more of an enjoyment, lawless, casual sex. Before that, there was, not from religious perspective, but at least from recent perspective, there was a liability, at least on the woman's side, that men can enjoy this and leave in 2 minutes, but women have to bear. A medicine came, and then eventually disconnected sex with reproduction. And obviously now disconnected with marriage also, because previously it was biblical morality, then it was thrown out of window, then it's reasons, society, socially awkwardness, and now it's just consent. Now, according to modernists and postmodernists, if you will ask them, especially to modernists, you will ask them, how do you define, because in Islam, in the tradition, we say appropriate sex is that which you do with your spouse after marriage. Premarital relationship is inappropriate. Extramarital sex is inappropriate. How do you define appropriate versus inappropriate sex when you have disconnected with marriage? They would say, because obviously entire idea is individualism, worshipping your individual self. So they would say, obviously they have to define sexual harassment. So they would say, we were going to define anything with consent and no harm is appropriate, and anything without consent and with harm is inappropriate. So they disconnected. They said, even if you're doing premarital, extramarital, with marriage, without marriage, with same gender, with different gender, as long as with consent, and as long as this is without any harm, by the way, they themselves do not even particularly define consent and harm, because I actually discuss it in my book, how hypocritical this entire idea is. You can read in my book. And then you can see now how society will going to divide and become self-destructive in the nuclear family. So this is the problem now. When sex is disconnected with reproduction and family, now marketeers will going to use sex as their tool to promote and to sell their commodity. As in marketing management courses, they have a famous rule of thumb: sex sells. Young people in the college, they will use this sex as a fun thing because now it's disconnected with marriage. And we Muslim also, we are confused about this worldview. SubhanAllah, some of the youth. So many a times I was speaking this last night to some of the YM kids in Houston, SubhanAllah. I was talking to them and their family also. I was telling them that see how this impact our worldview. So we would ask our kids not to get married until you graduate. This is, by the way, Muslims in the Western countries, we do this all the time. Do not get married until you graduate. And some of the families will add extra layer. Do not get married until you become something. We don't even know what something is. Somehow we become postmodernist because we don't even know, we define with our feeling what is that something. So until you become something. In that perspective, we are following the Western paradigm of education, because Western paradigm of education, you get education, you get settled, now you're ready to marry someone, and then you can get married. But on the flip side, we also enforce that no sex before marriage. So from that angle, we become Islamic. We come from an Islamic paradigm. even though from West, when they say no marriage before the graduation and before you become something and before you're financially become something, most of the Westerners, they will lose their virginity before the high school graduation. This simple Google fact, they will going to just reflect that and exhibit this. But on the flip side, you are following the Western paradigm and at the same time Islamic paradigm. And what it happens, if in such a sexually hyper exaggerated society, if we are delaying halal sex, aka marriage, then eventually we are giving very difficult choices to our own kids who want to preserve their faith, who want to preserve who want to protect their privates. So this is extremely important to understand this paradigm that Islam connected sex with reproduction and marriage. And our modern paradigm, and whenever you see Netflix, social media, Hollywood, trash of Bollywood, social sciences, humanities, philosophies, economics, sexuality, everything, including Miss Marvel. Even if apparently Islamic names in Disney's and these Netflix programs, they will going to cover things from a modern, postmodern perspective, not from Islamic paradigm, and that's why it gives mixed messages. We don't even know when we are thinking from an Islamic paradigm and when we are thinking from a modern paradigm. So it's very important for youth and for everyone who's listening to this to deconstruct some of your thought that, okay, I'm thinking about this. Why this thought even came to my mind? Because of the indoctrination I have. By the way, I think it's enough, inshallah. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept this from all of us, inshallah. So I will end here. I have just 1 minute because I have another session at 1:45 and I have to go. It's 4 or 5 minute drive from here. So let me know, inshallah, if there are any question. Otherwise, I know that Dr. Suzy and Sheikh Kaiser are more than qualified to take questions, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khair, Imam Asif. Just want to restate to our audience that your book is available on Amazon. Do you want to repeat the title of the book so they can search for it?
Yeah, it's Islamic versus Postmodern Paradigm of Sexuality, Rethinking the Rainbow. Rethinking the Rainbow. And you can just tap my name. Well, I'm not...
You can search on your
self-marketing, but yeah, you can search under my name and you will get it, inshallah.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Yeah, I just want to... I thank you for the historical perspective. I like to remind people that there was a crime in the United States called sodomy. Okay, it was against the law. It was against the law in New Jersey up until 1978, and there was a law against sodomy in Texas up until 2003. Texas was the last state to rescind its law against sodomy. I just had one question about the youth. How well equipped do you think high school age children are to interpret their feelings regarding gender? Because they're being asked to do so.
I think the most important thing here for all of us as a parent, first of all, parents need to educate themselves because it's easy to become a parent, but it's difficult to parent a child. So that's important. But for when high school kid or even middle school kid, but even high school kid comes to you, just make sure that you put them under the feelings paradigm and don't bring them under identity paradigm. Because in postmodernism, they will going to connect their feelings with their identity. And once you go into the territory of identity paradigm, then eventually you have chopped your hands. You have to accept certain notions of it, preconceived ideas. You put them under, okay, this is feelings. Feelings are natural and we can talk about this. But the moment you accept as an identity paradigm, then end of the story. You have accepted that paradigm and you will going to have certain assumptions where you have to make certain compromises. So it is obviously the job of therapist. I think people like Dr. Suzy and Sheikh Kaiser will be able to answer this in a better way from psychology perspective, because I think both of them are in the field of counseling. I'm not licensed therapist, but I would just say that do not accept identity paradigm, because otherwise you are playing in different territory. You're not playing in Islamic territory then.
Okay, Jazakumullah khair. Thank you so much, Imam Hirani. I can see that you've got someplace you have to go. I don't want to put you at risk while you're on the road. So inshallah, we'll move on with the program. Jazakumullah khair.
Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Suzy Ismail. Her topic will be parent-child conversation. Dr. Suzy Ismail is the founding director of Cornerstone, a nonprofit faith-based communication intervention organization with several locations around the world that focus on youth, family, marriage, identity, socio-emotional wellness, and relationship rebuilding. She holds a Master of Arts in Communication and a Master of Philosophy in Human Services and a PhD in Human Services, focusing on family studies and intervention strategies. Welcome, Dr. Suzy Ismail.
Jazakallahu khair. Thank you, Brother Jim, for the introduction. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And alhamdulillah, I am so thankful that we are able to gather and have this conversation, which I believe is, the first of many, because it's a topic that, as I can see in the comments, as I can see from the number of individuals who have signed up to watch this webinar, it's a topic that's so important and that we need to really discuss and understand and think together as an ummah about our children, because regardless of what age or stage our children are at, we know that our children are being affected by the language, by the messages, by the direct kind of pushes and agendas that we are seeing today. And particularly during this month of June, where the promotion of pride and pride concepts has become so prevalent. So I'm happy to kind of follow Imam Asif in terms of this conversation and talking about really what does it mean to be a parent currently, and how do we address as parents with our own children the topic of gender identity. And in the interest of time, I'm definitely going to stay focused more on the aspect of gender identity rather than the entire gamut of the LGBTQIA+ orientation, which includes, of course, sexual orientation. And I think, again, that's another conversation for another time. But I want to pick up with one of the last points that Imam Asif had made, which was that it's easy to become a parent, but that doesn't always mean that it's easy to be a parent. And what does it mean to be a parent currently? Let's start the conversation from the word identity. And if we pull up the first slide, I think it's incredibly important for us to begin with understanding our role as parents in the home and the recognition that even 10, 20, 30 years ago, when maybe the conversations in schools, the incorporation in the curricula was not necessarily focused on gender identity or sexual orientation, it was focused on other things that may have not aligned with our Islamic perspectives or with the Islamic identity that we have as parents been trying to guide our children towards. And even then, 10, 20, 30 years ago, what we taught in the home, who we are in the home, how we guide our children towards critical thinking was so impactful and remains to be one of the most impactful elements in terms of how our children respond to the push that is occurring around them today to secularize identity, to create a link between identity that is as far removed from faith as possible. And that's essentially what we're seeing today, that this push, particularly with children, towards gender identity, towards sexual orientation, the push to come out, right? The idea of coming out of the closet is such an integral part of the LGBTQIA+ community ideals, because it's an idea of flaunting the identity that is secularized, the identity that is linked to the desire, to the hawa, not linked to the love of Allah, not linked to the pleasing of Allah. And at the core of identity is really understanding where we get our definitions of self from, where our children gain their definitions of self from. Growing up, I'm sure all of us, if we're children of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, we can remember within our own schools, if we attended public school here in the US, for example, or even in Islamic schools and private schools, there was always, growing up, particularly, you start elementary, we see it really explode in middle school. And then in high school, we continue to see it. We see groups, we see cliques. In my high school, I remember there was definitely the table at the cafeteria at lunchtime that had the jocks, the athletic kids. There was the table that had back, in where I grew up, there was a lot of Italian Americans. So there was the Guidos and the Guidettes. Then there was the other table that had the popular kids. There was the cheerleaders table. And within that school atmosphere, there were divisions that existed because children at that stage, again, it starts in elementary. We often see it at a young age. And today we're seeing it younger and younger even. But it really kicks in middle school when children are going through hormonal changes, going through puberty, trying to figure out who they are. And what we see is a gravitation towards like-mindedness, right? Trying to figure out who I am and where I fit in. And for many of us, maybe, if we go back to our old high school yearbooks now, there's these online groups that'll say, oh, you graduated from this high school in this year, see what your classmates were up to. And when we take a look at maybe the children who were most popular at that time and see what they're doing now, or the children who were, part of the nerds or the geeks or the jocks or so on and so forth, we see that in adulthood, many times we've moved away from whatever identity we may have had in high school or in middle school or in elementary school. But what is happening with gender identity is more of a permanent scar, almost more of a sense of annihilation of the bodily identity to align with what a child is recognizing in that moment, feeling in that moment that this is who they are. When it comes to gender and when it comes to the war on binary gender, because that is what we're seeing, essentially a war on removing the idea that gender is binary, it's so important for us from a young age to guide our children towards an understanding of how Allah Azza wa Jal has created them. We know that our human fitra, that the tendency from birth for us to align with the way that Allah has created us, to have that innate taqwa, it exists in us, but we are socialized away from that fitra. And it's a struggle throughout our lives to try to regain that fitra, to try to reconnect with our basis in terms of identity in the way that Allah Azza wa Jal has created us. And so when we look to the Quran, and on the slide that was just up on the screen, we see several places in the Quran where Allah Azza wa Jal clearly reminds us that we have been created from a male and a female. In Surah Al-Hujurat, for example, we're reminded that this is how Allah has created us, from a male and a female. Two genders, only two genders. In Surah Al-Najm, we're reminded that Allah has created us as pairs, and those pairs are the males and the females. In one of my favorite verses in the Quran actually is in Surah Al-Imran, in verse 36 in Surah Al-Imran, when Allah Azza wa Jal is guiding us towards an understanding of Maryam alayha salam and the mother of Maryam alayha salam, at which point she gives birth to her daughter. And in that verse, in verse 36 in Surah Al-Imran, we are told that she turns to Allah and makes a dua that she had intended to dedicate what was in her womb to the service of Allah, but that she has given birth to a female, and that the female is not like the male, that the male is not like the female. And why this is so potent, why this is so important, is an understanding that in that moment, when the mother of Maryam alayhi salam is turning to Allah and recognizing that she has given birth to a female child, that the male is unlike the female, it is a contextually speaking kind of approach in which at that time, the female was not one to be raised in the mihrab, was not one to be raised in the temple, was not one to be dedicated to the service of Allah, which is the dua that the mother of Maryam had made, that she would dedicate what was in her womb to the service of Allah. And yet we know that Allah Azza wa Jal accepts Maryam alayhi salam onto his service. And this is kind of the starting point of the conversation that we have to have with our children. A recognition that there are two different ways in which gender is approached. Today, unfortunately, the push that we are seeing is the idea of gender dysphoria, that a child, an adult, a teenager who feels like they don't belong in the body that they were born into, that this is quickly labeled as gender dysphoria. But in reality, what we're seeing, particularly in our communities and in our cornerstone counseling offices, we see cases like this, I want to say, at least 5 or 6 times a week of children feeling that they don't belong in the body that Allah has created them in. If we quickly label it as gender dysphoria, which is the push currently, that means that the child is there's something wrong with the body, that it's not something wrong with the perspective, as Imam Asif had mentioned. When we look at it from the perspective of social dysphoria, which I want to say a large percentage of the time, what we're dealing with is social dysphoria, it's slightly different. Social dysphoria aligns with what we were mentioning in the Quran of when the mother of Maryam alayhi salam says that the male is not like the female. It is contextually that socially speaking, the male had different rights and different responsibilities and different roles than the female at the time of the birth of Maryam alayhi salam. And one of those roles was being a scholar of monotheistic faith. And yet, that social context is almost reversed, it's rejected, and Allah Azza wa Jal accepts Maryam alayhi salam onto his service. So social dysphoria often occurs within our communities when children grow up in homes or in families where they feel that the gender that they are a part of, male or female, does not capture who they want to be, does not capture what they believe or their level of comfort. So many times we'll have youth who come into our offices who identify, and say, yes, I was born as as Amina, but I don't see myself as Amina. I see myself as Ali, and I want people to call me Ali, for example. And many times when we work through the why, which is so important and so often rejected by Western psychological approaches today, when we work through the why, we begin to often understand that this is a child maybe who grew up in a family with, 4 brothers, and those brothers were allowed to stay out until midnight. Those brothers were allowed to, do whatever they wanted. And this child as a female was restricted from those things, right? And growing up, this female maybe begins to feel a sense of a hurt, a sense of identifying that it is her gender that is causing her to feel restricted rather than the social constructs that are occurring within the family. We also see it in examples, for example, the male child who grows up in a home where maybe the father is abusive, where maybe they have experienced great harm at the hands of another male. And so as they grow older, they reject the idea of being part of a gender that has caused harm. And so they don't no longer identify as male, they instead identify as female. Yet we see in each of these cases of social dysphoria, and again, I don't have the actual research data, it is something that we're working on, inshallah, but what we see anecdotally from the clients that we see so often in our offices is this sense of social dysphoria being at the root of rejection of gender, that it's something that has occurred, a view that the child has about society, about the way that gender is acted upon rather than the biological aspect of gender itself. When we are so quick to label it as gender dysphoria, though, then it becomes a problem of the body. When we begin to address these difficulties, and they are struggles, and this is something that is so important, that we cannot minimize the fact that when children, teenagers, youth, young adults, or even older adults begin to move towards this direction of questioning their gender identity, many times they are struggling, whether it's struggling with friendships, struggling with who they are, struggling with fitting in, struggling with trying to find their place in the world. And oftentimes it's struggling with a feeling of being unanchored, not having firm roots in being able to say, this is who I am, that my gender doesn't define me, my sexual orientation doesn't define me. What defines me is my connection with Allah. What defines me is my recognition that Allah is Al-Khaliq, He is the creator, Al-Musawwar, the one who creates us in the most perfect of pictures. And when our children are able to find their anchor within their faith identity, then they're no longer looking for an identity in gender or in sexual orientation. But if we go to the next slide, we begin to understand what is happening within our communities, in our schools in particular, and why so many of our children, and then when I use the term children, I'm talking about children from as young as age 4 or 5 years old up until age 21, because throughout that whole gamut, they are still children. And we recognize even from the Islamic conceptualization of tarbiyah that these are the stages of tarbiyah from birth until age 21. So what are our children seeing, and why are so many more of our children Muslim children? And this is something that's so important, that we stop living in a sense of denial, thinking that this is not impacting our children, our communities, because it definitely is. And being on the ground, and I'm sure Imam Kaiser will share from his perspective on the college atmosphere as well, we are seeing more and more of our Muslim youth struggling with gender identity, struggling with sexual orientation. And many times there's so much more to the why than what they are seeing. Because when they struggle with what they're feeling, where they fit in, who they are, maybe past trauma, maybe issues of molestation, of sexual abuse, of things that they have not come to terms with, have not coped with, have not been able to unpack, then so many times it's almost like the easy solution that's handed is, oh, it's a problem with your body. It's not a problem with your heart. It's not a problem with your mind. Because I will tell you, it's a lot harder to work through difficulties of the heart, to work through difficulties of the mind, than to go in and have surgery. Not to say that the surgery itself is easy, but it takes a lot of work to work through it on those other levels. But it's the work that lasts. It's the work that's meaningful. So what are our children seeing from a young age in school? Many of you may be familiar with these posters. If you enter into classrooms today, I'm in New Jersey, and so I know these are posters that we tend to see in a lot of classrooms in different schools. But the genderbread curricula was a curricula that was introduced a few years back. It began on the West Coast and made its way, of course, to the East Coast. And what we see within classrooms at a young age, and this is a curriculum that begins in kindergarten, we see this idea of the genderbread person, for instance, where every classroom has a poster and children are encouraged to almost desegregate within themselves their identity, their gender expression, their gender orientation, and their biological sex. And they're asked to almost rate what they are feeling, that in their heart, that's kind of a description of what they might be attracted to, their expression, how they choose to dress, how they choose to carry themselves, their gender identity, meaning what it is that they think of or how they think of themselves, and then the biological gender, the biological sex, and constantly being told that not one does not dictate the other, that just because the biological sex may represent something, then that doesn't have to align with the orientation. It doesn't have to align with the identity. It doesn't have to align with the expression. We've also seen more recently the gender unicorn curricula. And again, when I talk about why our children may gravitate towards gender identity as almost like a solution to solve the difficulties that they're struggling with internally, look how inviting the rainbow is. Look how inviting and welcoming the unicorn is. Look at the idea of a gingerbread man, right? Something that's so innocent and so childlike, being utilized to convey these messages. One of the most powerful kind of quotes, maybe, or the most powerful pull that is utilized kind of with the LGBTQIA plus community is love, right? And imagine a child who is struggling with who they are, their place in the world, where they fit in. I know growing up, I was definitely, the nerd in middle school. I was the only one wearing hijab. I was the one who had my nose in a book all the time, and that could be a very lonely place to be, right? Now imagine that you've got these rainbows, you've got these unicorns, you've got this inviting group that is saying love is love, that's talking about, this unconditional acceptance on one side. And then for us as parents, sometimes when we approach these topics from an Islamic perspective, fear causes us to close up. And rather than speaking from a place of love to our children, we speak from a place of fear. So we will say things like, I don't want you being friends with this person because this person, is whatever it is, homosexual, pansexual, demisexual. This person dresses like a girl, even though physically they identify as a boy or they look like a boy. And so many times we come at this conversation from that place of fear where it's haram, haram, haram. And yet on the other side, our children are hearing conversations in schools, hearing, in movies, in books, this idea that, the fluidity that is encompassed in, the love is love movement. But in reality, our Islam, our deen is a religion of love. Allah Azza wa Jal is Al-Wadud, right? He is the one that is most loving. And yet when our children only see Allah Azza wa Jal as Al-Hakam, right? As the judge, not Al-Hakam Al-Adl, the most fair of all judges, then they can pull away from faith and instead move towards these identities that are rooted in, a false notion of safety, a false notion of welcoming. And I say a false notion because we also work with individuals who years later, after going through trans surgery, after taking hormones, feeling intense regret for that change and recognizing that this has harmed them, not helped them. And it's interesting when Imam Asif was talking about psychological approaches and the fact that just a decade ago, in when the DSM manual in terms of psychiatric diagnosis listed the concept of gender dysphoria was actually a gender identity disorder. It was viewed as a disorder. Back then, it was not align your body to your feeling. It was let's work on the feelings. And it brought to mind the fact that, for us at Cornerstone, we work with a lot of refugee clients, a lot of asylees, a lot of people who have been victims of war. And many of these victims of war have also had, limbs amputated. And one of the conditions that we see is called a phantom limb condition. And what happens is that many times someone who has a limb amputated will still feel pain in that limb, even though the limb does not exist. Now, we don't sit with those clients and tell them, well, let's see, let's reconstruct the limb so that the feeling that you're having of the pain is actually justified. No, we work with the clients to be able to get them to see the reality and to accept that that limb no longer exists. And yet with our children who are struggling and in pain when it comes to gender because they are linking who they are to this switching of the biological, in the biological sense, instead of working with our children and guiding them towards an understanding that this is their reality, just like we do with the phantom limb syndrome, we don't tell them this is their reality. We tell them, let's change your reality. Let's move through the process of, creating a different reality. Now, some of the topics that we want to broach with our children, and I would say, again, I would start with probably as soon as they're entering school at age 5, right? When we have the conversations with our children about their bodies, when we talk to them about haya, about modesty, when we guide them towards an understanding of what their private parts are and, the no touch rules and the no touch zones and good touch, bad touch, all of these important conversations that we need to be having with our children. We also need to be having the conversations with our children on gender identity and what they're going to see in schools. And we have to be ahead of the rainbow. We have to be ahead of the unicorn and be able to explain it to our children and explain it to our children in a way that is rooted in love. So guiding them through an understanding that yes, people struggle, people have pain, and people when they are in pain will sometimes look for remedies for that pain. And one of those remedies that is being pushed today is the idea that you can change, not who you are, but you can change your body, you can change how you look, you can change how you identify. And teaching our children that Allah Azza wa Jal has clearly in the Quran designated the male and the female. When we look at the options, kind of the menu that our children have today, right, we see the idea of gender fluidity is, of course, the concept that if I feel male today, then I will, my gender expression, so if my identity is male, regardless of what my biological member tends to say, I will express this identity in as a male today. And tomorrow I might be a female. And the day after, I might identify as, neither gender, as a gender. So gender fluidity is having that back and forth. And imagine the instability that comes with that type of fluidity. Gender nonconformist approaches are ideas that you will not kind of align with the social construct of genders, right? Which again, when we look at it from an Islamic perspective, we know that the tashabbuh, that, whatever it is in the community, for example, that is aligned with the male externally, then the male should align with that. And with the female, it should align with that. So, for example, in the Saharan desert, for example, a man wearing a galabiya is considered something that is male dress. Here in the West, someone who wears something like a long dress that looks like a galabiya, that aligns culturally with male. Hence, that would go against what the social context of how a male should dress and how a female should dress. We also see, of course, the push for pronoun usage in our schools right now. And if we go to the next slide, we can see just an example. I had quickly gone to the Common App, which is the application that college students fill out today in terms of applying for colleges. And the sample, the Common App has like, how should you answer these questions? This is a question on the Common App. What are your preferred pronouns? And I think they've got, I didn't count them, but there's a whole bunch of pronouns here that we see. And we know that the list keeps growing. Recently, I know I saw an FAF as a pronoun now. An FAE is another pronoun. So every day it kind of grows, the list of pronouns. But what we're seeing is, even in the sample, the Common App has the LGB, FGB kind of X'd out as how you might answer preferred pronouns. In so many colleges and in workplaces now, we see introductions, people being told, please stand up, introduce your name, introduce yourself, and please introduce your pronouns, right? Now, this is something that we as Muslims, coming from a place where we recognize there is a male and a female, the question that we often get, and I believe Imam Kaiser is going to tackle this a little bit more, is, what do I do in that situation? What if I don't want to share my pronouns? I will tell you, I've been in a lot of meetings, gatherings, conferences, different organizational things where, when I stand up and introduce myself, I will say my name, say my background, and I will simply say, I prefer not to adhere to this usage of pronouns because I am biologically presenting as who I am. And so learning how to find language that works for us, where we can, politely, kindly, compassionately just share that this is not something that we adhere to. And this is so important in how we reach our children. Kindly, compassionately, lovingly, understandingly. So many of our youth will come to us, speaking about this topic, and they will say, my parents are homophobic, right? My parents are hate-filled. My parents are judgmental. And many times they say this because our response to, issues that come up under the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, or friends that our children may have, tends to be harsh. It's rooted in that place of fear. And we want to change the way that we talk about this topic. So being able to tell our children, someone who stands up and physically presents as male, you can see maybe that they have male physical features, but identifies as a female, right? Understand that this is someone who is going through some sort of a struggle. This is someone who is trying to figure out who they are. This is someone who maybe, need some help in that process and in figuring out who they are. So guiding our children towards that sense of compassion and telling them, we make dua for those who are struggling, regardless of their struggle, but also embedded in that compassion, being very, very clear in an understanding that Allah Azza wa Jal has clearly defined to us, the genders, the male and the female. Now, one of the follow-ups that I often get when we have these conversations is, well, what about the mukhannath? What about the third gender? At the time of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, those males who had effeminate traits. And again, there's a long conversation that can be had about this, but when we look at it contextually, we recognize that hermaphrodites are, again, a very, very small percentage, which is the physical manifestation of both biological sexes, essentially, upon birth. And that is not the norm. That is not what we're talking about when we talk about gender identity. Because when we talk about gender identity in the modern context, it is all about what someone feels, not necessarily something that is biologically a part of a person's body. So, language is important. And I think that brings me to my next point, how we talk about this topic. And the reason why language is important is because we see how language changes to adopt to the changes in thought and how language affects our thought. And subhanAllah, when we turn to the Quran, we see the impact of language when we recognize that Allah Azza wa Jal, in creating Adam, the first differentiation that he tells the angels when the angels ask why he is creating a human being who will cause havoc on earth, the first differentiation that is shared is that Allah Azza wa Jal allama Adam al-asma'a kullaha, that Allah teaches Adam the names of all things, because names are so important. And when we look at this from a philosophical standpoint, we see that there's two different approaches to language. There is one approach, which is known as the theory of sociolinguistic relativity, and another approach, which is known as the Satir-Whorf hypothesis. In the first approach, the idea is that words create our world. In the second approach, it's our world is created, and then words give the creation of that world a way for us to connect and affiliate with it. So what does that mean in terms of gender identity? When we used to fill out forms, right, there was no cisgender, right? It was male, female. There were no words, there were no names to distinguish between someone who is cisgender, which means someone whose biological elements align with their gender identity. And there was nothing that would really be used as in common vernacular as transgender or omnigender or agender or pangender or so many of the different gender terminologies that have been used. By creating cisgender, right? By putting cis before the word gender, you now open up the door for having a menu of other genders. And we can look at the example, for instance, of snow, right? When you look at snow, there's a tribe, the Inuit tribe, who speak the Inuit language in areas of Alaska, where when you look at the words that they use for snow, I think they have like 70 something words for snow, right? There's a word for snow when it falls in like big flakes, snow after a reindeer poops in it, snow that's like slightly yellow in color. And here in the US, we maybe have a couple of words, right? We've got like snow, sleet, hail, but not as many words as they have in the Inuit language. So does that mean that we don't have snow that a reindeer poops in? Or does it mean that we don't have snow that's slightly tinged in color? No, we do have those types of snow, right? If there was a reindeer to, walk through the town of Princeton, New Jersey, we'd probably have that snow. But it's not important to us. There's not enough reindeer that walk through snow and poop in it for us to label it. There's not enough importance in our lives for snow that is tinged yellow to impact us. Whereas for those who speak the Inuit language, snow is such a critical component of their lives that they have names for all those different types of snow. It's the same thing with what we're seeing with gender. When gender was understood in the way that Allah Azza wa Jal has described it to us as male and female, those were all the words that we needed, right? Because there was there, a mukhannath, was there a hermaphrodite? Was there someone maybe who had effeminate traits? Yes, but it was not the norm. It was not what was most important. What was most important was the other forms of our identity. Or it's like the word gay, for instance. I used to tell my kids growing up, again, I'm a child of the early 80s, growing up on the playground in elementary school, we used to sing a song. And the song was, I'm so happy today, I'm so gay, I'm so happy, I'm so gay. And that word was simply meant extreme happiness. It meant joy. When that word became co-opted and used to describe sexual orientation, just like the rainbow, just like the unicorn, we now put different meaning on the action that's affiliated or the identity that's affiliated. And so what we're seeing with words now, it's so powerful, and it's so important for us to understand how the naming of things brings it into our lexicon, brings it into our conversation. We would not have had a webinar on this topic, 4, 5, 6 years ago even, right? We're having a webinar on this topic now because it has become so prevalent. But we, in talking to our children, need to be very cognizant of the words that we use and how we convey that and communicate to them, because words are powerful. If we use words of hate, if we use words of judgment, if we use words of put downs, our children will flee from us because our religion will not seem like a religion of love to them, and will flee to that which is being promoted as the epitome of love. And so we want to be very conscious of our conversations. And to do so, we need to, of course, be very familiar with what's out there. Check that list of pronouns, know what's out there, understand what our children are also being taught in schools. I know for many of us, we're watching, situations unfold in California, in Maryland, Montgomery County, I know just recently had a huge issue where the opt-out policy by the board was removed, so that parents now have no right to opt their children out of sexually explicit conversations, particularly under LGBTQIA+ topics for their children. So we know that there are changes that are happening even in how our children are approached. We know that legally in many states now, a child as young as 13 can emancipate from their parents if the parents refuse to allow them to use the hormones in terms of transgenderism to change their gender. So there is definitely a lot that's going on, and I know I've taken up a bit more time than I should. So I'm going to go to the next slide, just because it's so important that we understand that there are resources, alhamdulillah. And I just happened to put up our website, our email address as well, because for us at Cornerstone, we are faith-based relational interventionists, and we work from a faith perspective to guide children, teens, young adults towards a better understanding of their identity, an identity that is not rooted in gender, an identity that's not rooted in sexual orientation, but an identity that's rooted in who they really are, not what they feel, but who they are. And so these are resources. There's a few other amazing resources out there. There's a brother by the name of Wahid Jensen, who you may have heard of. He has a website called Beyond the Rainbow, which is an incredible resource as well for Muslims who are struggling with desire, who are struggling with maybe issues of identity. And again, don't ever dismiss that the feeling really may be there, because again, we remember our own childhoods and when we struggled with identity, and that's a common kind of building block in terms of tarbiyah, a common building block in terms of growth. But how we respond to issues of identity and how the world around our children responds is so critical and crucial. So look into different resources. I know Yaqeen Institute offers some incredible articles on the topic that can help as parents, to understand and learn how to talk about it. And I keep seeing a pop-up on our screen about ask Masajid to hold these conversations. 100%, I am on board with that. I think as parents, and since my topic was parents, we all need to kind of mobilize to learn how to talk about this topic with our own children, with our schools, with our communities, and even within our own minds, how we understand it. So I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal protects our children, guides them, allows them to see their way through this storm and to hold on to their faith identity so that they can be the strongest Muslim Americans that they can be.
Ameen. Jazakumullah khair, Sister Suzy. Thank you very much. That was very comprehensive in a very short period of time. We've had a few questions that arose during your discussion. Some of these questions might be something that I might be better equipped to address, frankly, because of my experience at CARE. There was a question that says, I know that while being within U.S. laws, how far can I go to resent or oppose the LGBTQ concept? Just my question. I'd like to know how to oppose this while staying within the limits of human rights and U.S. laws. Basically, when addressing this, you need to be concerned about two things. One is hate speech, okay, and there are laws against hate speech, and the other is discrimination. There are laws against discrimination. Discrimination would be to deny someone services or benefits or employment. So you'll be breaking the law if you were to fire someone because they are gay or transgender. You would be breaking the law to deny services of someone. Now, there is a rather famous case. I think there are a couple of cases where there have been Christian bakers who have refused to bake wedding cakes for same-sex weddings. There's one case that went to the Supreme Court, and the baker ended up winning the case. That was considered a very narrow decision and not necessarily the final word on this whole thing. So it's suffice it to say that if you were offering services like a bakery and were to deny services to a gay couple, you could end up in court. Whether you win or not, that's a different story, but you could end up in court. Now, the other area to watch out for is hate speech. Now, hate speech is not the same thing as offensive speech. You could easily say something that could offend someone who is gay or transgender or pangender or one of those many things. If you just offending them is you've not stepped outside the law. It's when you have said something that is threatening. If there's someone, if you cause someone to feel threatened because of something you said about their identity, and this is the same thing for religious identity and racial identity and other things. That's when you've waded into some trouble. But offending someone will not get you in trouble with the law. Now, offending someone may get you in trouble with your employer, or if you're on the board of education or on the board of directors of some organization or a politician, you may get in trouble for offending someone, but you wouldn't necessarily get in trouble with the law. Sister Suzy, any comments on that before I go to the next question?
So I think I was just reading some of the comments here,
Okay.
trying to get a pulse. But I do think that collectively there's a lot that we can learn. Like even looking at the group in Maryland, I know CARE is very active on the ground in many different communities right now. And I think Brother Jim, we had talked about this before. I'm not in the position to give legal advice. Some people are saying, well, I could get in trouble in work if I'm not on board with the whole pronouns things. And I definitely hear you. I also think it's not the first time that we as Muslims in the West have been in a challenging position where something that goes against our deen is something that, we're hesitant about. But I think, when we turn to the hadith, that there will come a time when holding on to our faith will be like holding on to a hot ember. The idea is we don't let go. We don't just say, well, it's too hot. I might get fired at work. My child might be, scrutinized or put in a bad position. Yeah, it's, Allah Azza wa Jal tells us that it's not always going to be easy. I mean, look at the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there are going to be, difficult times and sometimes even repercussions. But I think if we as an ummah come together and say that this is important and that, guiding our children through this, they need us, and we need to be there for them. I think that's the best approach. So I would say, for the attorneys, for CARE, for those who are on the legal side, if you are able to publish something to give guidelines, and I know a lot of it is state-based, there's different laws in different states.
Absolutely.
But if we could get that going, I think that's a step in the right direction.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. A few more. There are a couple of questions that had to do with just sort of sex education in general for Muslim youth. They haven't seen sex education for Muslim youth in the U.S. We haven't had conversations about just heterosexual feelings that kids struggle with. The comment here is we never address it. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. So I love that point. And I think it's so important because, I still have young teen girls who will come into our offices, for example, and they say, I can't talk about, my period in front of my family. Like, during Ramadan, I have to pretend I'm fasting because I have brothers, because my mom tells me it's shameful. I can't discuss it. Or I have to pretend that I'm praying behind my father because I can't tell him that I'm on my period. So within our homes, words like period, words like sex, words like even gender identity, homosexuality, gay, we don't use these words in our homes, and yet our children are hearing them consistently in their schools, on the internet, in books. And if they don't feel comfortable and safe talking to us about it, then they are going to talk to their friends. They are going to go to Google and try to find answers. So as parents, if we can be the source, and we know, Islamically, la hayat fi din, that when it comes to matters of religion, there is a way that we can speak about everything that's age appropriate. And I know that there are several resources, and I hope that maybe after this program, maybe the Islamic Learning Foundation can put together a list of resources. There's a group that has published some information. I believe it's called Dear Muslim Kids, but don't quote me because I can't remember it exactly. I could share it with the Islamic Learning Foundation, and maybe they could share it as well, where there's information that's compiled on how to speak to your kids on these topics. There's a group out of Pennsylvania as well that I know provides sex education from an Islamic perspective, and they do go to schools when they're invited, and I encourage parents to reach out to them. Again, I can't recall the name, but I can definitely look that up and share that, inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay. So there seems to be a follow-on question to the question about the legality of what you can say. Rights for religious practice are also protected, and that should be addressed, and that's absolutely true. The Christian baker that challenged the rights of the gay couple to have that baker bake them a wedding cake said that baker was just observing their religious convictions, and again, the baker won in court. Now, it would be if you find yourself in a situation where you're in let's say a debate where you've said something that someone has interpreted as discrimination or hate speech, and your defense is that you were just exercising your rights to practice your religion the way you interpret it. It's something that, depending on the parties, may end up in court, and it'll be decided by a judge or a jury. But you do have a case to be made. So it'll be very dependent upon the specifics. But yes, you do have a right to your religious convictions. And by the way, there is a law in New Jersey that says you can opt out of sex education in New Jersey public schools if this is a violation of your religious convictions. So yes, you do have rights, but in the end, the specific circumstances will have to be looked at, in a court of law if it comes down to that. There was another question. I think it's kind of an obvious answer, but I think that's something you might want to expand on, Sister Suzy, and that is, should a parent abandon their child if they can't get it into their head and convince them that it's haram? And by it, I assume that they mean homosexuality, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, subhanAllah. So, again, we have our guidance like in the Quran, right? When we look at the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, he continued to give da'wah, he continued to call his son to the way of Islam, continued to teach his son La ilaha illallah. And up until he was, at the brink of looking out at the flood, and the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, sailing away, he was still calling out to his child. So I would say, we don't ever abandon our children, right? We want to continue to give them da'wah, to call them to Islam, but to also recognize that hidayah comes from Allah. And, any one of us could be in this position where our children struggle and are pulled in a direction that's not pleasing to Allah. So the importance of dua, making sure that we are consistently making dua for our children, but that we're also consistently cognizant that, we will be asked about our actions. How have we connected with our children? How have we tried to teach them? And hopefully, we can answer to Allah that we did all that we can, and we recognize that the hidayah comes from Allah.
Jazakumullah khair. Okay, thank you very much, Sister Suzy Ismail. Jazakumullah khair. I'd like to remind our listeners and viewers that you could help us to provide more sessions like these by going to icnanj.org/donate. If you'd like to support this kind of program and allow us to expand, possibly bringing speakers into your masajid and bring more webinars to the internet, some financial support would be very helpful. Jazakumullah khair. This is, again, icnanj.org/donate. Now we'd like to bring on our third speaker, inshallah. I'd like to introduce Imam Kaiser Aslam. His piece will be on social interactions. Imam Kaiser Aslam is the Muslim chaplain at Rutgers University. He studied various classical Islamic sciences in his studies within the United States and abroad, and holds a master's degree in Islamic studies and Muslim-Christian relations from Hartford Seminary. Welcome warmly, Imam Kaiser Aslam.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you so much, Brother Jim, for that introduction. And Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we send our peace and blessings upon our final messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي ربي زدني علما. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow what should be said to be said, for understanding to increase as a result of it, and not let my own or all of our collective weakness get in the way of actually moving forward and getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, regardless of what obstacle is in front of us. And I begin, inshallah, in a similar way that Dr. Suzy and Imam Asif had actually talked about this topic. And particularly where I was supposed to be jumping in today, it was on social interactions. How do we navigate this approach of this isn't something that's just being taught at an intellectual level anymore, but literally people's day-to-day interactions, how they talk to each other, how they interact with coworkers, that's being affected to the point where even my mother told me this morning that she wants to listen in. Because why? She wants to make sure that she has a correct conversation with her grandchildren in terms of how to approach this. So it's something that the cultural zeitgeist, it's really up in the air. And each and every one of us does have an air of responsibility in terms of understanding where our worldview comes from and how it is not necessarily our understanding of it currently might not be where it needs to be in order to encourage a proper inheritance of what our deen actually says about this topic. And where I actually begin today is very similarly to Dr. Suzy and Imam Asif. They had talked about kind of the narrative or historical background of where do we start from. And I know some of us listening today are like, just tell me what to do. Tell me what to say. Don't give me this understanding of where does postmodernity come from and all of this background. But the real issue here is we need to understand that. And the reason we need to understand it is this didn't just happen out of a vacuum. It was a historic precedent that leads to these ideas being so palatable for people to take on. Just as Imam Asif was talking and Dr. Suzy was talking, even 10, 15 years ago, the types of language that was being used was very different than the language that we're seeing in schools today. Where did this come from? We need to understand the narrative behind it, both from a historical and an intellectual perspective, so that when we speak about it, it's with some degree of coherence and with some degree of appreciation. Because if we use simple things saying, "Oh, Muslims just shouldn't even talk about this,"
Imam Kaiser,
yes,
your audio is fluctuating a lot. It goes from being a little bit on the quiet side to be all of a sudden very loud. I'm not sure what's causing that.
Let me see if there's some setting.
Okay.
Audio choppy. Is this a little bit better?
That sounded good. Maybe a few more sentences and we can tell.
Okay. So what I'm going to continue through, and maybe this is a little bit better in terms of how it works. Is this working fine? Or is it still going up and down? And now I seem to have lost. Am I gone? SubhanAllah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Is this a little bit better now?
I think it's still fluctuating between kind of muted and a little bit loud. But if that's just maybe the function of your equipment.
Okay, this is what I could do here. I'm not sure if that helped anything. Let's do this, go cancellation. Okay, is this a little bit better?
That was loud.
Okay, so I'm gonna try speaking, maybe not fluctuating my own voice, so maybe my mic isn't gonna fluctuate for me.
Okay, now it just went quiet. It just seems like it's gonna do it.
Okay. Well, we'll try to get through this as we can, but it's this approach of when we use very simplistic narratives like, oh, they're just following their desires. All they're doing is this. They just can't control themselves. The problem with that is it's not actually addressing the societal conversation that's at hand here. which is how do we interact in the world that we currently live in which, okay. How do we kind of explain the world that we live in? And where I'm going to go into, Jim, if you could bring up the first slide, is I'm going to walk us through this approach of how did we get here. And for some of you, this might seem like it's getting too into the weeds. Why do we need to understand the worldview in this way? But the main reason will be because society, it shifts and changes. And I'm going to talk about how we as Muslims, we've tried to put into place, and of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has instituted ways that our morality does not shift, but we need to understand why there is this shifting of morality that currently exists. And the way we do that is by first understanding and appreciating what is philosophy. And philosophy is oftentimes called the origin of all sciences. And if we have a brief understanding, a very small abstract on a history of Western philosophy, we can appreciate a little bit more why this is the natural conclusion that society has found itself in. And first, I'll just do the quick definition. I promise this won't take more than 4 or 5 minutes. But and because I know the slide looks very intimidating. But first, we have to understand what is philosophy. And philosophy comes from the Greek philosophia, which is this idea of love of wisdom. And generally speaking, it was used as the proto-science to answer 3 questions. The first was establish a metaphysical or a system, which was to explain what is the nature of all the things we see around us, or reality. The second was to set up a system of understanding, how do I know what I know? And that's called epistemology. And the last is to appreciate value theory, this idea of what is the right thing and the wrong thing, what is the beautiful thing and the not beautiful thing. And that becomes this approach of where values come from. And for those of you who are wondering, why do we need to go through this again? This is at the crux of kind of where the conclusion of love is love comes from. Why is that become such a significant phrase, and why does this acceptability need to be present? Actually comes from understanding the narrative through where we got here. And how we go through this is by historically going back almost 2,500 years to the origins of current day philosophy as it's experienced when we talk about I'm just checking in really quickly. How's the audio? Is it still very choppy?
Did you hear me?
Yes, I'm hearing you now.
Yeah, okay.
Is it still choppy?
It's better now. It's better
Okay.
now.
Great.
Inshallah.
So we start off with the origin of philosophy, which almost 400 BC, you have Socrates, who's oftentimes called the father of philosophy, and he is known for being this Greek person who asks a lot of questions. How do you arrive at a proper answer? By asking a lot of questions. And it's this idea that we can reason in order to figure out the proper answer to things. So I don't want to get too much into the actual methodology with each one, but there are even some traditions that would argue that maybe Socrates was actually a prophet of the past. And then from him, you get his students, Plato. Plato ends up having this major understanding and major contribution to this worldview was that there is a world of forms and a world of the reality that we live in right now. There's the material, and then there's the present. And it's this approach that if there's a concept called a table, we can build a bunch of different tables, but there's an ideal table somewhere out there that all of us are trying to replicate. It's the idea of dualism that comes in. There's an ideal, and then there's the practical. And then that idea gets taken forward even further with Aristotle. And I'm not trying to strawman any of these arguments. I'm trying to build a narrative here where his student Aristotle actually comes forward and is known as the one who invented modern day logic, or this idea that we can connect 2 or 3 ideas together in order to form an entire worldview. So if we took 2 or 3 conclusions together, we can have a 3rd or 4th conclusion that would be better than all of the conclusions that came in the past, and that human beings are important as creatures and separated from the rest of animals because we have the ability to reason. Then we have a long period of what seems like silence. And where it seems like silence will be, this might be another topic of conversation. Imam Asif addressed this a bit, where you have a moment of time in which there seems to be no progress according to the Western canon. Not saying there was no progress, but we go all the way to 1109, when Anselm, actually a little bit beforehand in his life, he developed what's known as Anselm's argument of ontological existence, or this idea that we can use logic to understand and appreciate why God needs to exist. Why this becomes a major milestone is before a religious tradition would just say you need to believe in God because you need to believe in God. But he says, no, we can logically appreciate why we need to believe in God. And his argument goes something like this: that God is the most amazing thing that the human being could ever imagine. And a thing that exists is better than a thing that doesn't exist. Therefore, God has to exist. I am not putting forward that as a very good argument for the idea of why God needs to exist, but it's this formation that even theology, even what you believe, needs to have logic behind it. Then we also have, around the same time, a couple of hundred years later, what's known as Occam's razor gets appreciated by this philosopher named Occam, who says that if any two theories are being presented about something, the simpler theory is actually the better theory. And though we would say, why would that be the case? Well, we could say that I got into this room through a door, or we could say through a series of hurricanes that somehow randomly spat out, I suddenly was formed out of nowhere. We'd say, well, no, I came in through that door seems to be the simpler solution. That's the one that we should go with. And that's the idea of Occam's razor. He starts developing this as, how do we understand the bad ideas from the good ideas? Descartes moves forward and introduces an interesting other element of, well, how about the human being? In 1650, when he passes away, his major legacy is he makes the big statement, I think, therefore I am. So it's this idea that I have to think about even my own existence. And how do I know that even I exist? Well, if I'm thinking about it, if I have some degree of rational thought, that means I actually exist. You have at the same time, actually, someone who's focusing on another branch of this philosophy, which is actually Thomas or Hobbes, in which he starts getting into this idea of, well, what's the true nature of human beings? And again, this is right after the medieval ages. He says, he's quoted as to saying three major things: that life in this time is nasty, brutish, and short. This idea that human beings left to their own devices are actually terrible. And it starts getting away from this idea that you are a creation of a divine source. But actually, if we look at what human beings do, we just do terrible things. So human nature by itself is terrible. And at that same time, in that same era, John Locke, who most of us, if we've studied within this country, know that John Locke, he's told as like the founder of secularism, or this idea of the nation state that we see today comes from him. But he really introduces the idea of empiricism with Bacon and others. But it's this approach of, we need to measure things, and measuring, when we measure something, that is actually more valuable than when we just see human perception of it. So it's this idea of introducing empiricism. Then we take that forward with Kant, which is rationalism and empiricism together, that when we think and we measure things and those two things come together, then finally we can form something even better than that. We form a basis of theories that are better than what people could think of by themselves. So you take the human element out of it. Then Hegel, the next major contribution to this, ends up saying, how do we know that knowledge grows? Well, we have a thesis, an antithesis, and then they come together with a synthesis. That this idea that we can start combining so many different worldviews to come up with a completely new worldview. I promise this is going somewhere. Then eventually that leads, after 1830, into one of the major philosophers, who's Nietzsche, who has that very famous statement in which says, God is dead and we have killed him. That's his famous statement. But I think it's not a triumphant statement of God is dead. He's actually looking at this and recognizing we have pushed ourselves into a corner, that the establishment of all of our morality, the establishment of all of our systems that we have in play that human beings have produced, were centered on God. And now we've reasoned ourselves away from God. So his actual statement is, God is dead and we have killed him, and the oceans will boil and the mountains will crumble because of the decay that our society is heading towards, and it is doomed. So it's this approach. It wasn't a triumphant God is dead. It was, we've completely destroyed our society, and to the point where that leads the place for current day philosophers, like where existentialism comes in with Sartre and others, this idea of Life has no purpose or meaning. And Sartre, particularly, who's known as the oftentimes the father of existentialism, says one of the most absurd situations is that people aren't just killing themselves all the time. That the fact that you don't kill yourself, that's an absurd reality because there's such meaninglessness. And we get into this idea of there is no absolute meaning, there is no absolute value. It's whatever you make of it in postmodernism and moral relativism. And now, some of you who are still here, you're wondering, why did we have to go through all of that? Well, it's actually to appreciate where did this idea that whatever feels right is the right thing to do. It doesn't matter what you say, what I say is more important. It doesn't matter what we can measure, how I'm feeling is more important because everything is relative anyway. Well, that's actually where some of this is coming from. And as a side point, philosophy, when we actually look at the study of, it's not the of some science in the traditional sense. It's actually the study of society's approach to things. It's more of a study of human beings and what they have become and are becoming rather than what guides what human beings are supposed to be doing next. So if we can get to the next slide. Then you have this in contrast. What does this lead to? It led to a situation in which you have moral relativism to the point where what I think and what you think can be totally different. And the fundamentals of society where we get information from is ourselves or what we measure. And what you measure might be different than what I measure. And we can't even agree on very simple things like what is a woman? Isn't that kind of odd that that's a statement that used to be just no one had to argue it, but now you have to wonder, what is it? Well, because what do you say? What do I say? We can't agree on things anymore, which on the opposite end is actually from the contrast of what our tradition would say is the archetype of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And we're told over and over again, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is told that you are on the millah of Ibrahim, you're on the path of Ibrahim alayhi salam, in which in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala captures in Surah Al-An'am, where Ibrahim alayhi salam looks over at the sky, he's looking for an ilah, and he looks over at the sky and he sees the sun, and he says, this is my Lord, and he sees that it sets. He's like, oh, that can't be my Lord. Then he sees the stars, and he sees the moon in a different order. But it's this idea of he's searching with his own senses, and he eventually realizes that his senses are actually really weak. And how does he actually need to break away from the weaknesses of his own senses is by relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to actually guide him. That's really the approach of our tradition that says you can arrive at certain conclusions and you're supposed to arrive at them, but eventually those are flawed. You actually need Allah to intervene and tell you what is the actual proper direction to be headed in. Because if you don't, you're going to shoot off in a bunch of different random directions. And just like physical forms need outside light to make them visible, human aql needs divine light, revelation or wahi to reveal unseen truths. That we have an increased reliance on God to provide certainty. That is, at the end of the day, the prophetic message. And that's the worldview that Muslims will take on, that it's not up to human beings to build themselves into the direction that society is headed in, but it's actually God who guides us towards where we are supposed to be optimally human. We recognize the weaknesses of human construction, so we rely instead on God's design. Next slide. And to illustrate all of this, for those of you who didn't necessarily want to follow the historical element, we can actually contrast this with two things. There is the archetype of the Tower of Babel, which is actually a story that's not found directly in the Quran, it's just referenced, but it's a story that's found within the Bible and the Hebrew Bible, which are texts that we know that there were revelations that got corrupted. But one of the approaches around this is the Tower of Babel, if you'll let me talk about it for just a second, was a society that that gathered together after the flood of Noah. And they gathered together and they said, we want to build a tower so tall that we can see God. This idea of like, we can see God for ourselves. Why do we need anyone else? And as they're building it, a punishment came down to them. And the punishment that came down to them was that they couldn't speak the same language anymore. And when they couldn't speak the same language anymore, they all decided to just abandon that project completely. Now, we in the Islamic paradigm, one of the things that we appreciate is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the sunnahs of God is that whatever you were already trying to do, Allah speeds you up towards it. That if you were heading towards direction, Allah will send destruction to you. But if you are doing the opposite, if you're trying to create a world without hunger, create a world without injustice, create a world without immorality. That what do you get as a result? You get Jannah, which is a place where none of those things exist. So one of the sunnahs of Allah is where your effort was going, Allah will push you further in that direction. And why that needs to be appreciated here is when you try to replace God, one of the things that happens at the end of the day is you no longer can speak to each other. And I'll actually share a personal example. I was at a university setting a couple of years ago. I won't name which university it was. It is not where I currently work at Rutgers, but it was at a university of the past. And I remember at the end of a session, I looked a lot like I did right now, but I had a kufi on, and I was leaving the building, and I opened the door for a young woman who was behind me, and I kept the door open for her as she was walking in. And immediately, as soon as she had walked through the door, she had a really angry face, and she said, "Did you just hold that door open for me because I'm a woman?" And I was in that moment, I didn't want to start a fight or make an argument or anything. And I kind of just bowed out and said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. That wasn't my purpose." And she goes, "Yeah, because I can open it myself." And at that moment, that's how I left it. I kind of bowed out and said, "Didn't mean to offend you. Just held the door open because you were behind me." And that's how the conversation ended. But I remember thinking back at that same situation and reflecting on it. I was like, you know what I should have said? I should have said, and of course I would never do this, but you've made me realize that I'm only going to now hold the door open for men. And somehow that seems to be worse than what you just accused me of. But of course I didn't say that, and I would never say that in real life. But I remember taking that to one of my teachers and saying, this weird incident happened. And the response I got was quite interesting, where it was as if you can't speak the same language to each other anymore. And immediately what was recited is وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. Hold on fast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together. That what seemed to happen there is we no longer could communicate to each other because holding the door open for someone behind you was considered just a normative good thing to do. But when society is headed in a bunch of different random directions based on whatever they want to do, society itself starts falling apart. And that's the society, unfortunately, we're in right now, in which you can't answer a simple question like, what is a woman? Because the underlying basis of what we would have actually relied on to pull ourselves into a proper direction has been so shattered that that's what we end up with, is people can't even agree on the most simple things. And if you can put that slide back up, the reason I have this idea is that rope that's leading you upwards is the model the Muslim community follows and we follow, is this idea, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. Hold on fast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together. Why? Because it's one rope. لَنْ فِصَّامَ لَهَا. It will never crack. That if you hold on to it, and all of us hold on to it, we all get elevated. So it's this approach. We're not trying to build humanly from the ground up in order to get to God. We're saying God has descended for us a rope, and all we have to do is hold on to it, and we will get ourselves away from our weaknesses, rather than cement our weaknesses into structures that are going to be creating a completely unstable society. And now, inshallah, we can move on to the next slide. Where I really wanted to go with this, and now we'll get into the actual idea of social interactions with principle, is we have to really appreciate and understand, where do we come from? We have to appreciate and understand that our worldview is actually based on something, and the worldview that we're facing is based on something. And we need to know the direction that we're headed in. Our worldview leads to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, leads to a society that recognizes common good, ma'ruf, and gets us towards it, versus the society which we can understand but we don't agree with, is a society that says, no, we're all individually building our own ways. Because when you do that, what's the highest principle that a society that wants to be individualistic gets to? Tolerance. I can tolerate you. I can tolerate your worldview. And that's the highest virtue. Versus in our tradition, tolerance is not the highest. That's the basis of where you start. And then you go even further than that. Is we need to appreciate that where our worldview comes from, we rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us, because at the end of the day, the fundamental purpose of our existence as individuals, as families, and as a society is to be in recognition of God. And when you pull that away, you're going to have people who say, well, I don't know if God is real. I don't know if society does have a direction that we should agree in. So what, you come up with the theory, they'll come up with the theory, they'll come up with the theory, and when all the theories fight themselves out, eventually one will come to the forefront. And we look at that and we understand it, but we respectfully say that's not the theory that I ascribe towards. And we actually look at that and say that it's not actually something that's good for you. Um, we shouldn't be afraid of reading texts by like Judith Butler, who oftentimes is understood. I think she wrote the book Gender Trouble, and a case for how feminism interacts with gender theory. And these intellectuals who really have this conversation of, no, this is where they have this full on direction. This is where society is headed. We shouldn't feel uncomfortable grappling with it, because one of the things is, if we feel like we can't even interact with it or even have a conversation about it, our children will say, oh, this is the same thing that people who are racist used to say, that I don't want to have a conversation about it. It's just the way things are. No, have that conversation. Recognize we appreciate where you're coming from, but we also say on the other side that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said that He created us as males and females, as men and women, who are created equal in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and have the actual ability of achieving the same status with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the most important thing. Yes, there are distinctions. There are things that men, according to the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Quran, are supposed to be doing more often, and women are supposed to be doing more often. But we take that from the Creator. We don't try to impose necessarily our own perspectives of, well, I think things should be like this. But on the other hand, we also appreciate that when we have unnecessarily rigid structures, it leads to extreme responses. And what I mean by that is our conceptions of gender, yes, we have them. There is a male and there is a female, but when they're too strictly enforced, that males only look like this and only talk like this, and females only look like this and only talk like this, people are going to want to break out of those rigid structures when our approach was never actually that rigid. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the perfect human being, but he had many qualities that we would call are completely masculine. There's actually a hadith in Tirmidhi that says, "Kana Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam kana rijalun." That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a man. That meant he was like manly. But on the other hand, he had qualities that many times in our society would be deemed as feminine. He cried, he was soft spoken, these type of things, because our understanding of what is masculine and feminine are actually pretty wide. That there are traditionally in today's context masculine traits that actually many women around the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam and in the household of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam embodied. And because that wasn't actually male and female, it was, we had a broader understanding of what a person could be. And when you have super rigid ideas of that, you actually end up having people who want to rebel. A simple experiment I've done with my students many times is, actually I can even do this right now. What I'm wearing right now is called a jubba, right? And it's a normative dress. We could call it. But if I ask the question, if a woman was to wear this, what would it be called? And it would also be called a jubba. If I was wearing a thobe, for example, if a woman was to wear it, what would it be called? A thobe. A sister Suzy beforehand, Imam Asif was wearing a thobe. Sister Suzy was wearing an abaya. If I wore this and it was a little bit longer, it would also be called an abaya. Why? Because how a male dresses in dignity and how a female dresses in dignity in our tradition was exactly the same. I'm not saying men and women dress the same, but I'm saying it wasn't a categorical difference in terms of what elegant clothing looks like, versus put that to the test against what is elegant wear for a man and a woman in society today, or even like 10, 15 years ago. What is it? It was so dimorphous. It was so different that a female has to show this to be elegant versus a male has to be more dressed. When you have these rigid conceptions of gender and what can be done, people start to rebel. Maybe it's just the system doesn't fit for me anymore. And that's one of the things we need to appreciate, is this is a reaction. And we can understand where the reaction is coming from, but then we actually say we present a different alternative, which is masculine and feminine. And I want us to be careful about this on a social level. Just because there is a huge narrative that is going out there doesn't mean that we embrace quote unquote toxic masculine or toxic feminine traits as a response to this. That's not it. Our sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam was actually the balanced path, which was that men and women are different, and we appreciate that, but we don't have them so rigid to the point where someone feels like they can't fit in, like being masculine isn't for me, being feminine isn't for me. That's one element of this that I want to appreciate. And on the other side, I also say that this idea of some of where this comes from is this pure sexualization that happens from a young position. We don't know what the full consequences are of that. One of the consequences that we're seeing might be what we're dealing with. We say we want to hold on fast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam that guides us through the societal trends that are happening left and right. But as we approach this, how do I then take it as a Muslim? How do I then take it as a Muslim? It's this appreciation that how do I interact with people? First is your mindset needs to be safeguarded. Your mindset. I'm seeing that the audio issues are happening again.
Yeah, it's a little bit up and down. It's a little bit up and down, but it's all. I can hear every word you're saying. I mean, at least
Okay.
I can. Yeah.
Got it. So the first thing is like socially now, what do I do? And the first is you first cement your belief, yourself, and also your children and your family, that have conversations about worldview. Why do we do the things that we do? And sometimes that means we get educated. Sometimes that means we attend lectures. I saw in the comments over and over again, we should have these conversations more in our masajid. And I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Have a conversation. Why do we believe what we do? Where do we want society to be heading? That our mindset needs to be appreciated, and recognizing that when we do this, when we protect our minds and we know that our direction that we're heading is a path that Allah set forward for us, and we as individuals and families and societies are happier as a result, we also appreciate and understand that how do we view people who aren't on this path? We don't hate them. People who are arriving at different conclusions than us, we recognize and we realize that this is actually harmful for them and it's harmful for us. That just because someone doesn't conform to our ideas of today, the major conversation was around gender identity. They don't understand gender the same way. They're actually suffering as a result of it. They're not in a necessarily happy place. And we have the statistics. I won't give these specific numbers, but to back this up, this idea of those that feel what used to be called gender dysphoria, or that are uncomfortable with their own gender, they're not coming at this from a place of like, oh, where as soon as you transition out, as soon as you embark on this journey, you're somehow just happily cured. No, but we have to have a nuanced conversation of the suicidal ideation and depression doesn't seem to be going down. We deeply care that this solution you've come up with isn't actually helping you. And we don't want to be like, let them do what they're going to do. We say, no, it hurts that this is the direction that society is going in. And we present the better alternative. And what is the better alternative? That yes, God has set rules forward in our tradition, and when you follow those rules, it's for the society to be more functional at the end of the day. And we can give case studies like the idea of like, well, Muslims are told don't drink. And it's like, well, someone could go, well, what if I drank responsibly? Wouldn't that be okay? And we now have the statistics and studies to say, actually, that might work for some degree of people, but there are going to be about 10 to 15% of people in any given society that are going to have what's known as substance abuse disorder, which means that even if they drink a little bit, they're not going to be able to control themselves. They have a physiology that leads them to be addicted more often. And 10 to 15% is a pretty significant amount. They can't ever drink moderately or engage with any psychoactive substances in that way. Our tradition, what it said is the damage is too great. Everyone should stay away from it. Is that necessarily fair? No, but it's the most functional for the society because it's not just about the individual, it's about the whole society. But Allah sees your effort. Have conversations about it, that we're talking about a working system. Marriage, will it work for every single person as the only means of expressing like a free sexual kind of intercourse in the traditional sense? Will it work for everyone? The answer is no. But will it prevent the most amount of harm for individuals, families, and societies? Yes. When we're willing to engage with these conversations and have them, we defend our own mind saying, I believe something that is a working system from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm not just like doing one of these to the society around me, because we at the end of the day are the legacy of Ibrahim alayhi salam, in which when he saw society heading totally off of, trying to throw itself off of a cliff, he didn't say, let them go. If anything, our legacy that we find is actually Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he was told that the people of Lut are being destroyed, he said, let me go to them and try to call them towards Islam. And if they don't come, then of course Allah's decree is Allah's decree. But it's this idea we care about people. Awahun munib, that he had a deep empathy for people. So we care about where other people are headed and where we're headed. But we stick to, of course, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in all of these cases, which is, of course, the approach of we are not going to see like same-sex behaviors or sexual interactions as ever being acceptable. But on the other hand, we also don't see those who have a propensity towards this, that they are just doomed in some way. No, it's this approach of we don't want to kick people away from a path, and recognize that some things might be more difficult for some people to act on than others. And Allah sees the difficulty that people go through. So we defend our minds, understanding why we have the stance that we do, why other people have the stance that they do. And then on the practical matters of social interactions of speech, well, how do I speak? How do I actually talk with people? What if I'm being told to say pronouns? And I really appreciate the way that Dr. Suzy answered this question, which is this really comes down to, on a legal basis, know what is required of you and what are going to be the consequences of your actions. I know personally, I work at a university in which on almost every meeting that you have with staff, they will start the conversation with like, my name is this and these are my pronouns. And this is something that's done in universities across the world. I have never once introduced myself with my pronouns. And why? Because usually I just won't say it. Or if I'm being pushed to it, I'll make a joke about it with like a smile, say, I don't think I am. People are too confused about what I am. And just leave it there. But your miles may vary on this. Your mileage may vary. And the reason I say that needs to be appreciated is know your principles, know what you're going towards. But if someone else makes a different calculation of how to handle this than you do, don't completely ostracize them. And we're seeing this, unfortunately, over and over again online, that someone miscalculated. They have the same principle as you do, but they miscalculated in the way that they talked about it. And they were more empathetic than you should have been, because you're like, I'm totally against this agenda. And yes, it is a systematic position that has been put in. But as soon as that's done, you say, well, we need to now cancel them. This isn't going anywhere. What we need to appreciate is, no, we have our principles set in play, and how we practically deal with it is going to be based on our context. There are some people who, through the pressures of their work, are going to maybe use pronouns or introduce themselves in that way. We don't completely say what you've done is wrong. We actually say the statement that's actually found in the Quran, فَاتَقُوا مَسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Be conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as much as you have the ability of doing so. There are going to be social circumstances in which you'll be able to have a proper discussion with someone to say, this is actually why I don't talk about pronouns, and I'm really happy to talk to you about it. So that I can explain it to you. That works in a private setting oftentimes. In a public setting, will that work every single time? Probably not. But know that in your speech, there is a power, as long as it comes from a place of, I understand why I am doing what I am doing, and I'm willing to have a conversation with you about it. But if push came to shove, sometimes we ask for like the legal answer. Are you allowed to do so? Use someone's preferred pronouns in that case. I would say on a personal level, again, I have the luxury oftentimes of not being a part of that conversation. But if another Muslim calculated differently and said, no, I feel like I'm forced into it or else I'm going to lose my job, I'm not going to cancel that Muslim. That's not going to be very productive for us to have. We should have communal conversations of, well, when we're coming down to teaching our children, what power do we have if we gather together, galvanize together, and say, we'd really prefer to not have this conversation. Who makes these decisions? Oh, is it the school board? Okay, can we send a letter to the school board? Can we have a conversation together? Can we elect someone onto the school board? I think these are proper conversations to be had of how we collectively respond based on understanding what our worldview is and where it comes from. And different places are going to have different responses. I know in New Jersey, you can opt out to get away from the sexual education curriculum if you feel like it goes against it. That might not be the case in every single state. Know where it is, understand who the experts are in the field, and make sure to get involved in that so that we can exercise our rights in the most appropriate manner. I'm going to put this as a side point, and I'm sure Dr. Suzy has experienced this, Imam Asif has experienced this, his brother Jim has experienced this. Sometimes with these type of topics, the first person to talk about them becomes the sole person who has the responsibility of now dealing with it, which is not fair. I remember I gave a lecture on campus about sexual ethics in Islam, and this idea of where does our sexual education come from. And right afterward, I had a couple of local Islamic schools ask me, can you do the same talk for our Islamic school? And this is where I had to set a boundary and say, actually, you should have someone on staff who can deal with this topic. Or if you want to have one of your staff members come to me and come up with a presentation together, I'm happy to do so. But we can't just have this outsourced. This is too important of an issue to just say that, oh, there's a local expert in a college over there. And it's not my expertise to begin with, but it's this approach of more of us should be qualified and recognize that we need to have people within our institutions that can speak about this, because if we don't have a formal way of speaking about this with depth, then it's just going to be seen as they have no answer. So all they do is hide. And we don't. We can engage with it. And when we engage with it, actually, our position comes out as actually very, very strong. So that's on the speech element of what do we do. We can advocate for it based on the context that we find ourselves in. If our context is the one in which we can opt our children out of a curriculum, great. That's our way to exercise our speech in the best of manners. If in a particular meeting you're allowed to say something along the lines of, I don't choose to partake in this, like Dr. Suzy had mentioned, mashallah, more power to you. But if someone else doesn't find themselves in that same space, we don't ostracize them and say, you're doing complete wrong. I can't believe you did this. We have to have empathy and with this approach. That's on that. I oftentimes on a campus level start getting those other conversations that people get into almost on a fiqh level. There'll be a Muslim a woman, for example, who'll say, well, if there is a friend who's attracted to the same gender, so if I have a guy friend who's attracted to only men, can I be a little bit looser with gender interactions with them or something? The answer is no. Our deen says, it keeps it extremely simple, that the rules of how you interact with people do not change based on how someone is expressing themselves in that moment. It's actually who they are. And the same thing can be said on the other side, on social interactions of, well, if there is a woman who's maybe attracted to women, do I have to now wear hijab in front of her or interact with her in a more limited fashion if she's a woman? And the answer to that is also, we go on a practical level, maybe because you want to make sure to have yourself protected, but on a legal level, no, you actually interact with her based on kind of her perceived and perception of kind of what her gender is. And we appreciate that our deen is very merciful when it comes to these things to some extent, but also is very simple, so that you don't have to really understand exactly what's going on in someone's mind in order to understand what's my ruling or my social interaction with them. It's go by what is what the general rule is going to be. And so that needs to be appreciated as well, is our deen actually presents this balance. And this balance is supposed to be that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put forward laws that lead to ma'ruf, that lead to the most amount of good happening for the most amount of people. Does that mean that there are exceptions in which this won't necessarily apply to? Yes, and we're merciful with those exceptions, but we don't say that every exception leads to a new rule. And that seems to be an odd impasse that society is finding itself in. That if you have exceptions to a rule, does that mean now we make a third or a fourth or a fifth or a seventh or an eighth or a ninth or a 10th category of rules? Or do we say, no, for practicality's sake, our deen has said this exists. Like men generally do this, women generally kind of have these tendencies. And if there are exceptions, we will deal with those exceptions, not saying that those rules now need to completely be rewritten in some way. This approach that we, our worldview says, we're heading, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. Hold on fast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together. Because when we do that, what's going to happen? We will all rise together to a common direction. When we don't do that on the opposite end, what's going to happen? Remember that example of the Tower of Babel? We're going to be creating this structure in which no one really understands why we're doing what we're doing, and we're all going to abandon this project of society in general. And we don't want that to happen. We are a people who deeply cares about not just ourselves and our families, but also the direction of our entire society at hand. And because we care about that, we will first start off by ourselves fortifying our perspective, fortifying the way that we speak to ourselves, our families, and the people around us, and then collectively how we respond, saying, we understand where you're coming from. We don't think this is the best place for society to be heading. We actually think it's better for society to be heading in a direction that leads to more families being together, more people having a common understanding of what is good and what is wrong, to gather together on these things. It's not just good for the individual, for just the Muslims, it's good for the society at hand, and we're going to do our part in order to make sure that starts happening. So those are just a few ideas I wanted to, inshallah, present for today in terms of socially interacting with this. Is first, fortify our minds, understand how we can use our speech effectively, and then from there, understanding how our basic institutions, which are ourselves and our families, need to have these conversations. Then from there, how we collectively respond based on whatever our context allows us to have, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability of understanding our own deen, understanding how our deen wants us to interact with ourselves, the people around us, and make us amongst those who are doing exactly وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا, that we're holding on fast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together. And as we do, we uplift not just ourselves, but the entire discourse around this issue, because it's absolutely necessary. I mean,
Jazakumullah khair, Imam Kaiser. Thank you so much. There were some excellent points being made there. We went all the way back to the Tower of Babel and came to modern times. So I think we now have a very well-rounded understanding of how we got to this point. Your audio did kind of come up and down towards the end of it. I think it did somehow improve. There might be a technical issue. Yeah, I've got a question. I mean, we're right in the middle of Pride Month. They've named this month Pride Month because of a movement that began, I think, back in the 70s. Just called Gay Pride. I'm pretty sure that the movement being called Gay Pride was largely a response to the fact that, frankly, prior to that, being homosexual was associated with a lot of shame, and pride being the opposite of shame. As a matter of fact, it used to be that in the military, if it was known that you were homosexual, you couldn't join the military. They wouldn't accept homosexuals, and the reason being is that if you were ever captured by the enemy, the fact that they could threaten you with blackmail in terms of outing you as gay would be it would make you too vulnerable to giving up secrets. So it was just assumed that it was something you would be ashamed of and would do anything to avoid being outed. So now when we talk today to either gay people themselves or any one of these sort of liberals who are very adamantly defensive of gay rights and all this, if we express our religious beliefs, how do we do that in a way that we don't make the counterparty feel as if we are shaming them or judging them?
Yeah. And I think this is where there's a two-pronged response to this. And I oftentimes say, and again, this could be my own background as a counselor and a chaplain, but to understand someone's worldview isn't just an explanation of it, it's to understand their own experience in that moment. A lot of the work is actually done in terms of how you interact, how you allow them to speak first, where they're coming from, express their hurt, and why they've really lodged onto this worldview before you actually explain your own. Which is actually, I can really appreciate that you're hurt. I can appreciate where that's coming from and how difficult that is. But on the other hand, we're a people that believe that you don't go through suffering unless God has intended that through that suffering, you could really elevate your position as an individual or as a communal group. But with that, we still value how God's prescription on this was supposed to be. That the only acts of intimacy that in our tradition are valued are those that lead to a family unit being formed and actually being propagated. Because we have actually said our sexual ethics and our family ethics are actually go hand in hand with each other, kind of like what Imam Asif was saying earlier. So you have the opportunity of maybe individually having that conversation with them where they feel very understood and heard. That oftentimes opens the door to this. And a portion of our tradition, one of the reasons that the Prophet ﷺ was such an amazing and brilliant teacher. I cannot recommend the book With the Heart in Mind, The Emotional and Moral Intelligence of the Prophet ﷺ by Dr. Imam Ahmed Smith enough. In it, he gets into when someone feels like they can fully kind of be vulnerable with you, then they are willing to allow your idea, even if it goes counterintuitive to their lived experience, because you've now offered the same thing to them, they can offer it back to you. So I think we start with first listening, appreciating where it's coming from, how much hurt it's caused. And then on the other hand, once we've done our part to listen, then that opens up the idea, well, we've arrived at a different conclusion, which you might not agree with, but it also has a epistemology behind it that is just as significant, if not more so, than the one that you are currently following.
Okay. That's something that I think a lot of people have to work on as far as being able to incorporate that level of thinking into their day-to-day interactions. There's an interesting question here. I know someone, his job is saying they all have to wear a pride shirt for Pride Month. Obviously, someone has to be a Muslim. He has been avoiding it and doesn't know what to do. How do you address something like that?
SubhanAllah, this is it's a difficult situation to be in. And this is where I say someone's individual context really needs to be appreciated and understood. That there's those of us who heard that question and say, you should just leave and you should just quit. Because why? It's not supporting what your religion can ask you to do. And as much as I can respect and agree with that answer, there's another part of me that says, we don't know what this person's situation is. Do they have the ability of actually finding another place of employment or not? That would change how acceptable it is to do that. How rigid is this? Are they the only ones who have dealt with this? Are there other coworkers who also have a problem with this? So maybe they can talk with them and then send a letter over to a supervisor or whoever's in charge of them to say, I really don't feel comfortable with this. But it's this idea of do your part. It's almost never you either do this or you don't. Do what you can to show that this really goes against my understanding of what I think my faith wants me to do in this moment. Is this a workplace that values faith and spirituality? Well, if it is, then this is my best way of really maintaining my faith in that moment. And I'm not the only one. I've talked to my coworkers. I've talked to someone else who feels similar. Really, I would say you see the resources that are available around you and respond. And if push came to shove, none of that is available. That's a difficult choice for that person to make. And we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whoever's put in these compromised situations, to facilitate ease for them and to reward them for the efforts that they make. Ameen.
Ameen. Ameen. Another question about Muslim doctors. How would you advise a Muslim doctor who is being asked to prescribe gender transition drugs and drugs used to enable sexual promiscuity?
I'm outside of my depth here. I do not work as a medical doctor, but I would say something similar where I think this is for us as entire fields to respond. There should be maybe a coalition of Muslim doctors, and I'm sure it wouldn't just be Muslim doctors, others as well who come together and say, if we want to hold up the Hippocratic Oath, which is that do no harm, that's what every medical professional has to go through. I find this to be something that's extremely harmful to my patients, so I can't in good conscience sign off on it and see if there are others who agree and group together for that. This is very context sensitive. I don't understand enough about the medical system that's being put forward there, if it's a public hospital, if it's a part of a hospital chain, but I would work it through the actual policymakers at the hospital to say this is something I really do not agree with.
Inshallah. Okay, Brother Yassine, could you bring Dr. Ismail back into the panel and we can expand the discussion? Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Ismail.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Alhamdulillah. I'm just wondering, do you have any comments about any of the discourse of the last 40 minutes or so? I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Jazakallah khair, Imam Kaiser. I think, sometimes we can feel almost like a little bit out of our depth when we dive into the history and the philosophy. And I appreciate the groundwork that's kind of set and the importance of us understanding it. I think I often come at this topic from the perspective of our children and where they're at. And for so many of them, I mean, they have no idea about the origins or, so many of the incredible, important philosophical kind of trajectories that you provided, or they have no clue about postmodernity and some of the things that Imam Asif talked about. And I think as parents too, you hit the nail on the head, Imam Kaiser, when you were saying, like, sometimes we just want to know, what should we do? We're in this. This is it's all around us. We see it everywhere. What do we do? And I think I kind of take off my counselor hat now and I put on my parent hat. And I do think, first of all, recognizing that we have been here before. There have been other situations that, somebody had mentioned conversations about heterosexual relationships or attractions. I agree, growing up, everyone had a boyfriend, everyone had a girlfriend. And that was the topic that plagued, my generation, maybe in public school. Currently, it's something else, that was something that went against our faith. And growing up, I think my parents as immigrants also struggled with being able to have those conversations with me and my sisters about why, from an Islamic perspective, we should not engage in any sort of emotionally intimate relationship prior to marriage. And we had to kind of stumble along, and I'm sure many of us were in that. Our goal with our children now is that maybe we lessen the stumbling, that we have an awareness, that we have talking points that are very much age appropriate for our children as well, that we equip our children with the ability to critically think using a faith-based lens, so that regardless of whether it's gender identity, sexual orientation, or God knows what's going to come in the next 10 years, but there will be other things that come up in the next 10 years, that our children are prepared not just to speak of the topics that they're currently seeing, but how they can tackle everything that's to come, because there will be more. And I think just from a parent perspective now, yes, like, be familiar with the background, but the core of this, difficulty and how do we tackle it as a community is learning how to talk to our children. And learning how to talk to our children begins with compassion, begins with love, begins with really giving our children a firm, safe, secure space to connect with us as parents, and giving them a sense of pride, but pride in their faith identity, because that's what we're up against. We're up against a society that's pushing pride in an identity that is, completely opposing the concept of faith and the restrictions of the nafs. And that's what we need to shift the narrative. So that's kind of my 2 cents, that yes, let's familiarize ourselves with the language and have a sense, an idea of where this is coming from and an understanding, but let's also learn how to talk about it just in conversational terms, whether with our children or with our colleagues at work, or in the school systems.
Inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. I see an interesting comment here about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We as Muslims who are acknowledging the fact that we are a religious minority in this country have certainly benefited from the supporting and promoting of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We support the politicians that support this, and we have reaped a lot of benefits from the societal inclination towards diversity, equity, inclusion. Now, at the same time, these concepts are what has now include LGBTQ. And so when you say I'm all for diversity, equity, inclusion, well, now you're essentially inherently saying I'm all for supporting the rights and Pride Month and everything of LGBTQ. Any comments on that?
So I think this is one of those situations, and we face this on campus all the time, where a student will say that anytime there was a discrimination against Muslims, who were among the first allies that came to the table, even the idea of who was an ally ends up being groups that really advocated for acceptance on all fronts. So oftentimes you'll have the same social causes. Like if there's a event going on for undocumented students, for example, or undocumented workers who came to the table, who came there, and we partnered up on this. And was that okay? And this is where I first say that we come together on acts of righteousness, where can we join part if someone else, just because they represent another identity, can we say we will never join that thing anyway? No, we advocate towards good wherever the case may be. But then on that same way, we also say the other side, which is don't gather. Don't gather on sinfulness. Where can we then say just because someone was there for us, we need to now be on the forefront with them as well? No, I think a conscientious disagreement should be respected and appreciated as well. That we can appreciate that you came forward because we have many principles that we agree on, but this is going to be a space in which we don't think we can participate because we don't think it's good for you or for us. So we will actually step back and not necessarily be as present. It's not an all or nothing response, and I think on the hand of even Muslim politicians, this is something that needs to be appreciated. That just because you represent one color, not to say which color that you are, doesn't mean you agree with everything under that platform. We're not monolithic because our deen doesn't allow us to fit into one neat box. The only full box that our deen allows us to go into is the box that is created by our deen. Like no other generic one. Islam is a full methodology at the end of the day. The only methodology it is completely compatible with is Islam. And that's how we would answer that.
Okay. Inshallah, jazakumullah khair. Yeah, I've got another question here. It's kind of interesting. It says that because of Pride Month, some public schools show kids videos of gay couples and lifestyle. It says, how do we respond to this? I'd like to also mention the fact that it's not just in schools. Mainstream television, the networks, this month, every time they go to a commercial break or something, there's some big swirl of a rainbow and say pride is everywhere or something like that. Or, it's like they're promoting it at every turn. Besides the fact that a lot of the mainstream, television, tends to include, for instance, if it's a fictional show, they include gay subplots. There seems to be, gay characters almost everywhere you look. And then there are, of course, advertisements on TV for, medications for HIV that show, gay couples being very gay. So how do you address this with your children? Again, let's focus on the what's going on in public schools first, but also there's a bigger picture where it's going on in sort of mainstream television if they watch television. Someone like to answer that?
So I would just say, and I'm noticing that it's 4:30, and I do have another program to run to, so I'm going to have to probably sign off in a bit. But just to respond to that question, I would say the same way that we respond to, for years, movies have been showing a boyfriend and girlfriend kissing, right? They've been showing romantic, intimate relationships that exist outside of marriage. These are movies we grew up with, things that we were shown in school, things that were talked about. And the same conversations that we have with our children, letting them know that things that displease Allah are all around us. Actions that displease Allah are all around us. But as Muslims, rooted in our faith identity, we don't partake in those actions. And we recognize that they exist, and we also don't judge. And I know this is a topic, I know I'm opening a can of worms here, because a lot of people will say the don't judge culture is actually, detrimental. But there is a difference between advising, and when Allah Azza wa Jal tells us in the Quran, وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ, advise with truth, advise with patience. There is a difference between advising sincerely and ad-din nasiha, so we do have to advise, but judging is saying, this person's going to the hellfire. No, that's not for us to say. That's not what we should be encouraging our children to say. That's not how we should be responding to the struggles that people have when they are engaging in actions that are displeasing to Allah, because those same people may actually be more beloved to Allah when they repent, when they return to Allah, than anyone else that we know. So guiding our children towards an understanding that they will grow in a society where people will reject faith and will act in ways that are not aligned with what's pleasing to Allah. And they will see this all around them, but that is not who they are, and that is not the pathway they should follow. and that they should advise, so that if the teacher is talking about same gender relationships, you had mentioned before, Brother Jim, that people can opt out of sex education for religious reasons. I think one of the difficulties that we're seeing in our school systems now is that reading a book during story time about a family, Heather has two mommies, for example, a family where there are two moms, that's not considered sex education by the schools. A parent can't opt out of story time for a child. And I think that's where we're seeing a bit of the difficulty. It's not quite as cut and dry as, when we were growing up, where our parents would just say, you're going to skip the chapter or the unit in health class on sex education. So I don't think it's as amenable to us anymore for us to be able to say, oh, our kid is just not going to be exposed to that. They are going to be exposed in some way, shape, form, or other. We have to equip our children with the ability to recognize that they will see things in this dunya that are actions that don't please Allah, just as at the time of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But what differentiates them is that they are on a path towards pleasing Allah, and so they will not partake in those actions. And it's a message that we say to our children and we say to ourselves as well, because for us as well, it's a constant battle and a struggle to kind of suffocate the nafs and elevate that connection with Allah.
Okay. Dr. Ismail, just before you were just saying something about you had to go to another program, and then you temporarily we all got cut off. I don't know if you noticed. So what were you saying about that? You have to leave before 5?
I do, yes. So I know that this program was supposed to go till 4, I believe.
Till 5, actually.
Till 5. Okay, nope. I'll stick around then. My mistake. I apologize.
Okay. I'm just want to make sure we're on the same page. Okay. Yeah, just a few more questions I'm seeing here. There was one from a student that says, what if our school makes us wear a sticker or attend a reading or watch a video about pride? So the school is actually saying, hey, it's Pride Month, you wear this sticker. How do you respond?
Yeah. So I'll inshallah take this. One part of this is there have been major figures online who talk about this idea of compelled speech laws, and generally speaking, and not that I want to give people platforms who don't necessarily deserve them in all of their views, but I remember there was a certain online personality, Jordan Peterson, who said, came heavily on the side of, you can't force me to say certain speech. And though he faced a lot of opposition, I think eventually there was this recognition and realization that morally and socially, many people sided with him eventually. And I know, again, a very controversial figure, because he also has said some what I would call extremely Islamophobic remarks and problematic things as well. We take the good and we leave the bad. But it's this approach of there's very few times in which you can be compelled to say that without there being any consequences. And I would respond to this very similarly like I did before. Know the culture that exists there. Has anything like this ever been said before? Are you the only one who has this conscientious objection to this rule that's being provided? And is there no space for the policy to change? Because a lot of these are very new policies, and unless they get challenged, they will stick into precedent. So it becomes our responsibility oftentimes as a creative and moral minority to voice and say, this isn't something I necessarily agree with, and can we force everyone to do something that is actually still controversial? That is something that all of us shouldn't be necessarily obliged to do. So I would say that's on the wearing of something. The idea of watching something, I'm going to echo off of Dr. Suzy's response. Our children are going to face this in some place or another. And the approach of we bubble them to say that we don't ever let them see it, I think is a failing argument. It's the idea of, I'm never going to give my child a phone or give them internet access. They're going to get it. And I have, again, on the other side of this, as a someone who works on a college campus as a Muslim chaplain, I've interacted with children who never grew up with ideas other than what was given in the home. And I wish I could say, and it leads to them being very functional adults at the college level, and they don't do anything wrong as soon as they get there. Unfortunately, on the other side is they felt so sheltered that they had no idea with how to engage with it, versus those that had actually been exposed to the ideas when they were intellectually ready for them and they grappled with them. They decide to sometimes choose their family's inheritance of morals and their deen's inheritance of morals because they got the choice of between the two of them, rather than saying, well, this was never available to me, let me see what's available now. So we have to be cautious in terms of, we don't just hide from it. We have very thoughtful conversations. And when it's brought up in school, read. This is where I would encourage us to go to the library of your children's school, see what books are available. And when it's deemed as one isn't there, yes, can there be a conversation that say we'd like that book removed? Maybe, but on the other hand, it could be just me having a conversation with my child saying, yes, I know this book says this, but also keep in mind, this isn't necessarily something we read, because as Muslims, we do this. I know I have a 7-year-old, and conversations that I have to have with her are very simple, even things like Eid. Well, we're Muslims. That's why we celebrate this. That's why we eat this way, because we think it's better. We like this. Didn't you have so much fun when this happened? Having these conversations that even applies to how we view family, how we view morality. Why? Because this is actually good for us. Happens at a very young age, not just when we're doing damage control after the fact. And where I'll just stop with that is the Quran gives us this motivation. But sometimes we think that, this is unprecedented times. Not that this is a direct comparison, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Qasas describes how Fir'aun had a completely oppressive system. But the solution to that in the very next ayah was, and Allah told the mother of Musa to feed him when it was the time to feed him. Why I say that's such an interesting point is Allah says we intended to teach Fir'aun a lesson. And then right afterward, how did that happen? By one mother doing her job properly.
Inshallah.
That can happen. A mother doing her job can actually change the trend of the entire society. And we're people that believe in that story. We're people that believe that happens. So don't underestimate the efforts that you have in those one-on-one conversations. And I'll say this as a place of kind of privilege, but I see people on a college campus that sometimes we think that, they're never going to have a correct approach to this because this indoctrination has happened for so long. When presented with and interacting with it with some level of respect and discourse, our students, our children can make correct choices. We don't have to deem that they're just going to be consequences of the education system that they come through.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. I just want to pick up on one minor comment that you made about if we don't like a book that we see in the library, possibly we could have it removed. State Senator Andrew Zwicker, who represents the 16th District, which includes South Brunswick, has introduced a bill that would disallow the banning of books in libraries. So you would not be able to have a book removed from the shelves in New Jersey's libraries. And there are a number of books that do have offensive material, that do have even material that it's targeted at children, that you could even consider pornographic. Where several communities within New Jersey, Glen Ridge comes to mind, have attempted to have these books removed and have largely been unsuccessful. But because of these attempts, there's now been a bill introduced that would actually make it illegal to even attempt to have a book removed. So that's something we need to, keep an eye on, frankly, and something that we at ICNA CSJ are likely to try and take some action on. I have a question. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to make a comment about the books because, it's interesting because I think when it comes to the book banning, like it can be a bit reactive, right? We see a book, we recognize that it has material that's harmful, that can impact our children. But then again, like Imam Kaiser said, you look at the phone and the things that they can access online. I mean, I want to say like hundreds of times worse. But I just remember growing up, and for those of you, again, who are children of the 80s, you maybe remember the Babysitters Club. And there was one book, I remember it still very clear. It was book 6 in the Babysitters Club, and it was called Marianne Likes Logan. And not just my mom, but all of the moms in the community, the Muslim moms in the community said, don't let your daughters read that book. They can read book 7 and 8 and 9, but they can't read book 6 because it's called Marianne Likes Logan. And of course, it was the innocent high school crush or whatever it was in the book at the time. Guess what every Muslim girl at that age, at that time did?
Went and read it.
We found a copy of that book and we read it. And when I think about it, and even, with my own children who are grown adults now, but, one of the most important things that we really kind of strive for in our household is being able to open the lines of communication so that if our kids do go to the library and see a book or even check out that book, even if they read that book, that they will come and discuss it with us, that we will have a conversation about it. Because you could ban, every book under the sun in the library now. next month there's going to be 10 new ones and 20 new ones and 30 new ones. So I'm not a fan of the idea of like, let's remove the literature that's there. Instead, I would much rather we teach our children that critical thinking, that ability to feel safe and secure at home, that when the teacher during story time reads the Heather Has Two Mommies books, they come home and talk to us about it, and that we're prepared to guide them through their response.
Okay, inshallah, yeah.
And I don't mean to just keep adding on to this. And I think the response here, I definitely agree. I think the censorship to the point of like we want this removed is usually a failing battle. The one point I would say for parents of really young children is when you have that personal relationship with the teacher. I don't mean remove the book from the curriculum or from the library, but just if you have a conversation with the teacher, sometimes there can be this approach of, oh, I'm not so comfortable with that. Something along those lines. And I think it starts adding to the point of be more involved in, I care about what my child is learning. Because the parents that do that, the teachers are more available because it's like, oh, they're going to give feedback versus other parents who might not care what their children are learning. And that's what I mean by, it's not necessarily you get it removed, but it's this idea of express your discomfort. Maybe this isn't the greatest material, and maybe express that to the teacher or somewhere along those lines. So something could be done with that opinion. I oftentimes I agree with you to say we need to remove it or get it out. It's adding to this approach of like, oh, they don't want to see it. They don't want to ever interact with it.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's up to us, let's say leaders of the community, to let the community, the parents in the community know that there are things in the library that you will have to have, very delicate discussions with your children about. Don't just think that, okay, it's the public library, anything in there should be okay, and they should just like go ahead and roam free. There's a question about modern society. Is there a connection between the gender identity discussions and the masculine feminine discussion happening also in today's discourse? Would someone like to take that?
I'll take this from a campus level. And one of the reasons I had said we don't want to get into the policy of just saying, well, if this side is doing this, we're going to join the complete opposite side, is because extreme reactions don't work. That our position has always been, we're not trying to be anti anything. We're trying to be following the example the Quran and Sunnah put forward. Because when we get into the thing of trying to go on the opposite side, so if they're feminist, we're going to be in like masculine in such an extent that it starts seeming misogynistic. It starts seeming toxically masculine, or whatever the case may be. Or on the other side, if we're for complete gender roles in every regard, it's not a good solution necessarily. And I will say we're in an interesting moment with major figures of like, what's the role of misogyny in society? What's toxic masculinity, toxic femininity? And people get so caught up on the labels, and I think these things are related to each other. That when you have too rigid conceptions on what is an appropriate personality to be, people are going to want to break free from them, and that's the reaction that we're seeing. Our response was supposed to be, and that when we look at the prophetic sunnah, when we look at what a man or a woman is allowed to be. I remember I had to give a talk at a local masjid in New Jersey on what is prophetic masculinity. And then as I was talking about it, someone raised their hand and said, can you talk about what is prophetic femininity? And I had to respond with, the actual principles are the same between these two things. Like what makes someone prophetically masculine or prophetically feminine is the same. It's just oftentimes the slight difference is the context in which it's expressed. That you have examples of a man is supposed to be what's properly masculine and like capable, available to help those around them, be someone to react and be a source for good. And be like, well, what's a woman supposed to do? Well, it's actually those same things too, but it could be maybe in the style or demeanor in which it's done, or the context in case there's no one else to do that thing. Then maybe you step up because you prioritize a different part of what makes a functional society. That's more of your role or priority first. But the actual roles between both of them is just to have a functional and good society.
Alhamdulillah, inshallah. Okay. Yeah, here's an interesting question. That's it's something that actually is something that people are having to tackle, and this is how far things have gone. How do you manage guiding Muslim young adults who are exploring gender-affirming treatment in the form of hormones to appear as the opposite gender? And then there's a follow-on question: is this the result of a mental health issue? But I mean, I know that there have been questions that have been put to Masajid about, quote, transgender Muslims. Do they pray with the brothers or the sisters, or should there be a third space? So the concept of transgender Muslims is now become a reality. So the question was, how do you manage guiding Muslim young adults who are exploring gender-affirming treatment in the form of hormones?
Yeah. So, I mean, Jazakallah khair for the person asking that question. And I think, a lot of our conversation is like preventative, right? How do you prevent it? But what happens if somebody is already in that frame of mind where they've, regardless of talking to them and giving them resources, that they've made that decision, or even they've moved forward with the hormonal treatments and therapy without sharing that with their parents. And we do see a lot of cases of that as well. First of all, I would say, don't give up. Right? Allah Azza wa Jal tells us in the Quran, لا تقنطوا من رحمة الله, right? Do not despair of the mercy of Allah. So if this is your own child, if it's a relative, a niece, a nephew, a child in the community, don't lose hope that, this child has taken those steps. And as difficult as it is, I know that there is also entire groups and communities of detransitioners. And detransitioners are those who transitioned, but then realized that this is not what they wanted. Imam Kaiser was saying how when we look at, like, statistically, the aspects of, depression, anxiety, suicide ideation that someone may link to gender identity when they do go through hormone treatment, surgery, kind of the transgender movement, a lot of times the issues are not resolved, which kind of speaks to part two of that question. Many times, seeking to change your gender, there is something that the individual is struggling with, something emotional, something mental. So something on, it's not just a physical aspect. There may be issues of self-esteem. There may be issues of self-image that they're grappling with. There may be relational issues. There may be issues of trauma in the past. There may be just difficulty in terms of identity and finding their place in the world. So, again, I'm a bit biased, but I'm a huge fan of counseling. And I do think that someone who has begun to transition, even, it's never too late to try to guide them towards seeking counseling, to speaking to someone, preferably someone from a faith-based perspective that can help them navigate through what they're going through, maybe help them anchor their identity in something other than gender, get them to see and understand that even if they have started these hormonal treatments, that, the end goal may not give them the satisfaction that they're seeking, and it may not be the right pathway. Again, right now, depending on the state that you're in, children as young as age 13 can move forward with treatments, and they call it gender affirming treatment now, if they so choose, without parental permission. So it may be something that you're encountering. So number one, don't give up. Number two, try to find guidance for this individual, particularly, counseling, if possible, from a faith perspective, that will help them see a different side to this push of gender affirmation that they're surrounded by. And, look into some of those groups that, like I said, there's online, you can find so many of them, of detransitioners that talk about the pain and the heartache and the increased suffering that they encountered after going through treatments, after, getting surgery done, and maybe being able to reach the young adult in that way.
Okay, inshallah, jazakumullah khair for that. Yeah, we're getting close to the end of the program. Here's an interesting question that just came up. How do you talk to a 7-year-old boy about homosexuality? And by the way, given the sex education curriculum in New Jersey, by the age of 7, this would have come up in school, unfortunately. So it's going to require some parental intervention.
So I think it would be the same way, especially when we're talking about the formative years, and formative years 7 would fall right within that, is when the major concepts of someone's life are really being determined. it has to be from a prescriptive and not a reactive state. That this is the same time in which you're supposed to have a conversation on what makes a family. This is supposed to be the same time in which you're supposed to have a conversation about like what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do. Basic morality is being taught. So instead of saying, I know your school is saying this, but don't listen to them, listen to this, it's this real big emphasis on giving them positive examples of why why marriage is important, why a family requires both a mother and a father to be successful, and why marriage is a sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Marriage is the best way in which a family feels protected and happy, and then talking about that eventually there will be a time in which maybe you are going to be wanting to start a family of your own. And then from there transitioning over, some people think that all you need is just attraction for a family unit to be born, but our understanding of family is bigger than that. So starting from these very basic affirmational spaces, rather than it seeming to be a complete, I want to tell you what not to believe. No, it needs to start from, this is what we actually believe in a really rightful way. And we want to be amongst those that were educated first, so that even when a child heard the other, they're like, that seems different. Not the first time I heard it was in school. Because again, we control our inheritance more than trying to undo the inheritance that they're getting from another worldview.
Inshallah. Okay. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Ismail, is there something you wanted to add, or are you okay with that?
No, I mean, I think Imam Kaiser said it really, really well. I would just say again, like, don't underestimate the power of books and storytelling at that age. At the age of 7, a lot of times it's hard to kind of connect with reality, and sometimes through storytelling, it is the best way to connect our children. And there's 2 great little books that I always tell parents to read with their kids. One is a Muslim boy's guide to life's big changes, and the other one's a Muslim girl's guide to life's big changes. And the other website I was talking about, it is called Dear Muslim Kids. And if you do /sticky situations, there's a whole curriculum almost in terms of how to talk to your kids about this subject. Have those conversations with your kids through stories, like being able to read books that from an Islamic perspective that, talk about what is happening. It also relieves the burden. I know one of the comments was, as an immigrant parent, how could I even find the words to communicate this with my children? Don't underestimate the power of books and storytelling, especially at a young age.
Okay, thank you.
One point that I wanted to make on this is, especially for those who are going through some sense of not feeling like they belong, they maybe identify with one of the letters on a spectrum. One of the things that needs to be appreciated is this is the time that they need more care, not less care. And I can't tell you how many times, and I'm sure Dr. Suzy can also elaborate on this, but someone was maybe feeling down and they wanted to now interact with their friends, but because of how taboo this topic was, they lost all social credibility. Because suddenly someone thinks they're on the sexual orientation spectrum. And suddenly in the moment in which they needed the most amount of attention and processing something and going through a tough time, now their community has completely ostracized or shunned them away. So this is, if someone's going through this, providing them more private care. And I know that's a difficult thing to balance, because especially when it's a public presentation of, well, if we gave them care, is it now saying this is what we stand with? No, we should have the ability of understanding. If someone's going through it, we provide them mercy and empathy and say, whatever you're coming in with, our community is here for you. Though that doesn't mean that a community has no stances on a matter. This is, as a counselor, something I face over and over again, where we show empathy. Why? Because they're going through something really difficult, and we want to ease their path in terms of how they're going through it. I've had personal interactions with a student who was not actually in this case didn't have same-sex attraction, but their friends thought that they did. So their friends all collectively stopped talking to them. And now what started off as, I feel weird about this, and the person opened up in my office saying, I don't have same-sex attraction, but now all of my friends left me. I don't even know if I want to be a part of this religion anymore.
Oh, man.
Because what started off as just I was interested in learning about it, and now look how homophobic my community is. Why would I even want to be there? What started off as a intellectual curiosity now led to a crisis of faith. when it was from a complete overreaction. So we want to be careful and provide more care in these moments, not less. And don't think that things have already gone so far where I need to make massive interventions. Reaching out one-on-one, and especially for the masjid who's dealing with this, provide them an individual expert that they can go to. I think counseling is a counselor, if there's a local one that's available, an educator who can have a one-on-one attention and give them empathy will really make the difference of whether someone decides to leave from the community and be a paragon or a poster child for this agenda, or someone who goes, no, in my time that I needed help the most, I was shown empathy. So maybe that's going to be what keeps me here as part of this community instead.
Okay, inshallah. All right, we're very close to the end of the scheduled time, the allotted time. So I'm going to just finish with just this one last question, and this is really about really policy, within a masjid, which unfortunately is something that we may see more of as far as an issue that'll come up. Unfortunately, may Allah guide us and hope and make this easy for us. But the question is, what about those who are identifying as something other than male or female and have started to transition or have transitioned and is now using Sister's prayer space and restroom? This is essentially like, how does the masjid deal with this? As a chaplain, I hate to tell you, you might have to deal with this on the campus.
First thing I would say is this is really a case-by-case basis, and our primary principle is to have rahmah and mercy and compassion to someone who's going through it. We had a case on campus in which someone was actually they were born as part of the intersex community, and that's different than trans, and I want to make sure that that's appreciated. But I was actually very impressed at our campus community of when there was a legitimate need for there to be a transition from one space to the other, for people to be empathetic and understanding about it. And to make that happen, we want to get people, if they've already started that, one is we would refer them to a local expert. Have them talk to a counselor, and have that counselor then maybe tell the masjid instead of having a blanket rule. I don't think this is we can just do one thing, because it's a lot more complicated in terms of, well, was this starting off as intersex? Was it someone who's just thinking about transitioning and they might transition back? Do they know that if this happens, this can't be gender fluid, like going one gender and then back and then back and then back. It's actually, if this is a decision that's been made, it's a decision that's been made completely. It has too much context for there to be a blanket answer to it, and I'm going to leave Dr. Suzy to add to that.
And that's fair.
Yeah.
Dr. Suzy, what do you think you'd like to add?
So I know in just like 30 seconds before we wrap up, subhanAllah, just in Ramadan, I had received a call from a masjid in California, where a few weeks earlier I had given a talk there, where just this situation had happened. There was someone who was believed to be a woman who was wearing a niqab, who turned out to be a male who was transitioning, who had taken off their niqab in the female bathroom. And then, throughout Ramadan, this person had been very, present in the female spaces. And of course, using the female bathroom at that point, and the recognition that this was biologically someone appearing to be a male caused a big problem. The way that the California masjid handled it was, first, the administration did try to speak to the individual, trying to better understand like where they were coming from, what was happening. The individual did, got a little messy. He did threaten, whatever pronoun he was using, threatened a lawsuit against the masjid. There was a lot of legal aspects involved in terms of the right as a faith-based space. Is it considered discrimination if someone identifies as one gender and the masjid is deciding that that's not the gender that they're presenting as? In the meantime, they did create a third space. They did create a separate bathroom. But this was just this past Ramadan, anticipating that we're probably going to see more of this. And this is where, again, Brother Jim, I turn to CARE again to help in terms of the legal aspect, because it is very state-based. I know places of faith are protected within certain guidelines, though, and certain limits. And it's kind of new territory. So I do think masajid everywhere should probably have a task force, but especially in the blue states where we're seeing this happen at a much more rapid rate, have a task force ready. Islamic schools need to have a task force ready to be able to address this, because I think it's something that we're going to be seeing within the next few years in our spaces as well.
Inshallah, unfortunately. Okay, I'd like to thank the speakers. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you so much. May Allah reward you for your time and your efforts. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm very grateful for the very meaningful discourse that we've had today, and grateful for the those that have tuned in to learn about this topic from an Islamic perspective. And inshallah, please watch this space. Look forward to ICNA's ILF for more programs and information on this topic. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.